How are you feeling?
Well,
How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you?
That's difficult to answer.
I'm not clear. How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
That's difficult to answer.
inside my head of crying people facing death. Is this the end? Is this the end? I'm burning in the there's no place to hide. I'm burning in the this is the final time. What have we done to the world? What have we done to the world? I'm burning in the there's no place to hide. I'm burning in the this is the final
What up, everyone? Happy Tuesday. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. Well, it's going to be a rather boring day because we're going to do something fairly traditional on the channel. I was looking around the old YouTube homepage, as I'm prone to do when I'm looking for recommendations on things to watch. And, you know, there's a couple interesting things that are suggested to me on my YouTube homepage. One of them is the clip that I made from yesterday's stream about Andrew Wilson crying so badly in my replies on Twitter. And if you missed that whole thing, go watch that video because we're not getting drama. No, we're not getting, we're getting a little, just a little bit. Can I do, my grandmother would call it a smidgen. Can I do a smidgen of drama and then we'll do important work? So, of course, Andrew Wilson, we talked about Andrew Wilson just crying in my comments. And you guys should see some of the comments I'm getting from Andrew Wilson's fans. They're like, you're too stupid to debate him. And why don't you just drop everything? You're afraid. I'm like, I've been asking him to debate for weeks. He couldn't even set a time on a calendar. Then he comes into my replies all belligerently yesterday. Not yesterday, 2 days ago. And he starts calling me names and he starts demanding I rearrange my entire schedule for him. And I'm like, no, child, no, we don't reward children when they're having temper tantrums. And you, Andrew, had a little bit of a temper tantrum in my replies the other day. And so we're not going to reward bad behavior. We teach people how to treat us. I'm not going to respond to someone belligerently coming into my replies going, fatty, 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 change your schedule to debate me at 9 p.m. tomorrow, bitch. Like, I'm not doing that. If he wants to follow through on the shit talking that he did on his own show and debate me, he can DM me like an adult and schedule a time, or he can send an emissary to DM me like an adult and schedule a time. We are not barbarians on this channel. We do things like adults. I know I'm asking too much. I'm on the internet. You can never ask people to behave like adults on the internet. God knows. So that was on the homepage of my YouTube recommendations. And then look at this. James Lindsay's newest thumbnail. He managed to get the word Nazi in it twice. The Nazi experiment, Hitler's Nazi race ideology. So I'm sure what James Lindsay is going to be arguing is Hitler was a literal critical race theorist. Hitler was the original critical race theorist, which I don't think is actually accurate, but I'm also not interested enough to find out. I just don't care to listen to James's little Nazi podcast. I just thought it was funny that James managed to get the word Nazi in the title twice, just to emphasize that this is about Nazis, okay? But what I decided to watch was this one over here. Check this out. The New Racial Regime. And then if we go into the title, Recalibrations of White Supremacy from Pluto Press. Pluto Press, of course, one of our favorite socialist book publishers. Are they changing the definition of white supremacy? Are we changing the definition of white supremacy now? Well, let's see. This is from about a week ago. We are joined on the show by Elena, author of The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. We discuss the white lash against the teachings of history and slavery and colonialism, the counterinsurgent capture of the institutions of anti-racism, I don't know what that word is, and decoloniality in the services of Zionism. So white supremacy is now working in the services of Zionism, according to the far left, and settler colonialism, and we all know what that means, and how the war on anti-Semitism reforms white supremacism at an acute time of genocide. So are we now making the ironic definition, leftists, that Zionism is literally pushing white supremacy? Is that what we're arguing now? And I want everyone to understand Jewish people don't consider themselves white. And so the idea of Zionism and white supremacy, it kind of just underscores the whole whiteness means capitalism thing, because Jewish people don't consider themselves to be white, but they do consider themselves to be the settler colonists. And the left considers them to be the settler colonists as well. And we all know what settler colonist means. It means capitalism. It means the bourgeois. It means the property owner, the person who stole the indigenous land and privatized it under the oppressive force of capitalism. That is what the Zionists are. They're not white as in skin color. They're white as in capitalism. And so we're going to watch this presentation and we're going to find out how the left is redefining white supremacy, the latest and greatest talking points about what white supremacy means today. And so it's going to be kind of a chill stream, I think. I think it's going to be a good stream for new people. We got a couple orders of business before we get started. Number one, if you missed Spy Stream last night, holy shit. Spy Stream last night was crazy. So I got into a New York City Democratic Socialists of America private meeting. This isn't like a public organizing call. You had to be a member of the NYC DSA to get into this meeting. They kept all non-members out. They told the press to leave and all that stuff. But I got in. I somehow got in. I snuck in the back door. And here's what you guys need to know that came out of this spy stream. Zoran Mandami is absolutely 1,000% going to win the mayor's race in New York City, and it's not even going to be close. So on this call, the DSA laid out all of their data for us about the election. One of the things that they told us is Zoran got 20,000 individual donations in New York City during the primary race. As a point of comparison, Andrew Cuomo got 2,700 individual donations, and the Republican running got less than 900. So there are a metric ton of people in New York City giving to this campaign. This campaign raised $1 million faster than any of the other campaigns. This campaign, they beat Andrew Cuomo by 12 points. And if you look at the breakdown, Andrew Cuomo actually performed exactly like he should have, but it was actually the other candidates in the race who underperformed, which is why Zoran shot ahead of Andrew Cuomo. They were out recruiting at mosques all over the city. They were trying to weaponize the Palestinian argument, saying the Democrats were sucking on Palestine to all the Muslims at all the mosques. They had teams of people all over. They had 300 people in a church meeting with them last night and 200 additional more on Zoom. And these are all members of the DSA. Like, I had to get a backdoor way to get into this meeting because you had to be a member to be there. He is going to win, and it's not even going to be close. If you heard the energy in the room, and I definitely recommend all supporters go back and watch the spy stream, the sound is a little bit janky sometimes because the sound kind of sucked until halfway through, but you could still see the slides, you could still hear the information, and it was terrifying. Oh, by the way, the NYC DSA, they're doing massive voter registration drives all over the city of New York. And if you look at voter registration, it is shot through the roof. And guess who the new voters are voting for? They're voting for the DSA candidate. They also have a massive turnout operation where if you look at the rates of turnout across the city, it correlates directly with where they've been registering new voters, and it correlates directly where with Zoran had the biggest wins. They have got this thing locked. Like, I'm sorry. Andrew Cuomo does not stand a chance against this. Eric Adams does not stand a chance against this. The Republican does not stand a chance against this. All three of them put together probably would still lose to the DSA candidate. And I would bet, unless something insane happens, because you never know. You just never know. But unless something completely insane happens, Zoran Mandami is going to be the next mayor of New York City, and I'm calling it. And everyone bookmark this, and everyone clip this, and everyone hold me to this. I would be shocked beyond belief if anything even came close to the organizing of the DSA in regards to Zoran Mandami in New York City. And this is the problem. This is the problem every time the right goes around going, they're mentally ill, they're lazy, they don't have jobs. I'm sorry. The DSA in New York City has got their act together on this, and they're not just thinking about this campaign, they're thinking about all future campaigns. So they're trying to set this up as a model that they're going to use over and over and over and over again. They're internally funding it. It is all coming from small donations. There are a metric ton of people financially donating to this campaign. There are over 50,000 volunteers for this campaign, and that number is just going up, 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 up. There is nothing the Republicans have that can match the organizing of the DSA. There's nothing that Cuomo and Eric Adams have that can match the organizing of the DSA. If he loses, something crazy happened. I have to leave that caveat, but anyway, if you're a supporter on the Substack or on YouTube or on Twitter subscriptions or a Locals member, you can go back and watch the replay of the supporter exclusive spy stream from last night. You can find it over on the Substack. That is Karlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. And when you sign up as a member for $8 a month or $80 a year, you do get to join me for that and all future spy streams. If you can't make it to the spy stream live, you can catch the replay on demand. And if you want to be terrified with the fact that the Democratic Socialist is absolutely going to win the mayor of New York's race and it's not even going to be close, hey, go watch the spy stream we did last night. No one else has the footage. I'm the only one with the footage. You're welcome. Karlyn.substack.com. Sign up as a member, $8 a month, $80 a year. I am 100% funded by people like you, and we will, of course, be doing many, 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 many more spy streams, all throughout the summer leading up to the fall. It's a big year in leftist organizing, and it's awesome. Also remember that on Thursday, I am doing a free online class because I have a lot of new people in my community recently. So people have been asking, Karlyn, do you have an easy way for us to learn about the language of the left? And I say, here, take this 4-hour workshop. And then they say, that's too long. I don't want to spend 4 hours on this. And I said, well, maybe I could try a smaller introduction. So what I'm going to be doing on Thursday is I'm going to be recording this live class. You can come to it and watch it live. It's totally free. It's called Re-Education and Anti-Communist Introduction to the Far Left. And the goal of this is to actually have it on demand so that new people have something to go and watch. You can register for it for free, share it with your friends, share it with your family. There is an option to make a donation, but you don't have to if you don't want to. It's totally fine. It's just there if you want it. But this is completely for free. And you're going to be able to ask answer your questions. And it's going to be a very basic introductory overview. So for those of you who've been watching my content for a long time, this probably is going to be too simple for you, but I have to create something easier that I can actually give to new people to kind of help them understand the language of the left, so that when it comes time to watch things like the presentation we're going to watch today, the new racial regime, recalibration of white supremacy, they can understand what the language means without me having to stop and explain everything. So we're going to be doing that on Thursday. I hope everyone signs up for that, and that'll be great. Let's see. Oh, by the way, I just did an interview with Mel K. So make sure you're subscribed to the Mel K Show over on Rumble. I'm not sure when she's going to be posting our interview. She usually gets it up pretty quick in like a day or so. So we just spent an hour chatting. It was a great chat. So I don't know when it's going to be up, but make sure you're subscribed to Mel K. I love her. She's awesome. We haven't talked in a long time, and so I really appreciate her. She's a little crazy, but you know what's great about Mel K and her husband Rob is they do actually watch Socialism Saturday. So they actually listen to me. Mel K is the rare influencer that actually listens to what I say. And she asks some great questions on her show, and she knows all about the WEF and all that sort of stuff, and I don't cover that at all, so that's really great. But that's going to be up hopefully this week, and people will be able to enjoy that. We got a couple super chats. I was watching Candace Owens last night when I hear the name Breakthrough News, and I started thinking, this can't be real. Is she about to use a video from socialist propaganda? Oh, yeah. Did Candace know she was using a video from a socialist propaganda channel? Maybe Candace should have talked to me before she used a video from a socialist propaganda channel. Oh, wait, she blocked me on Twitter. She can't. Too bad. So sad. Thank you, Naruto, for that. Much love from Seattle, Karlyn. Yeah, I bet you're having a fun time in Seattle. Lots of socialism in Seattle, two ladies. Lots of socialism in Seattle. Please be careful, stay safe, all that stuff. What else do I have here? Oh, here's the other thing. So, as you guys know, I have been, well, up until this point, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to keep doing this now. As you guys know, I have been spending my evenings listening to Twitter spaces where men are talking about how Christianity is a Jewish psyop. And I've really been enjoying that. And, it kind of goes along with Adam Green's work and all that stuff, which I enjoy. I enjoy hearing the men talk about their different perspectives and the different historical context and all that. And sometimes they argue and they fight, and that's all fun. But generally speaking, I have actually been enjoying these Twitter spaces that I've been watching. And one of the people that I've connected with via that and via Adam Green is Amalek. And I didn't like Amalek at first because I thought he was kind of a dick in my Twitter replies. And so I blocked him, but then we made up and I unblocked him and all that. And Amalek and I have actually been talking. Amalek, I've really enjoyed listening to him in these Twitter spaces. And so I decided I wanted to get to know him a little bit better. And so I decided and asked him, and he agreed to it, to do a little chat tomorrow on Twitter or an X space, whatever, where we're going to learn about, he's got a whole interesting backstory of like, being part of this like pro-white Richard Spencer like thing. I think he may have been involved with Charlottesville or known people that were involved in Charlottesville or things like that. And he's just got a really interesting story. Like he used to be a Christian and now he's full on like, going for Adam Green, like giving him everything he has. And he does a lot of clips for Adam and all this stuff, really supportive of him. So now he's doing this, like trying to break people out of the Abrahamic matrix thing. And he's really articulate and he's really smart. And I've enjoyed chatting with him and I've enjoyed listening to him. And I think you'll enjoy listening to him too. And we're going to be doing that Twitter space tomorrow at 9 p.m. So you can join us over there for that. And it's going to be great. But you guys know what sucks? Do you guys know what sucks? Is that I don't even know if I can listen to those Twitter spaces anymore because big tech is being an asshole. I talked about this yesterday and I'm going to complain about it a little bit more and then I'm never going to talk about it again. Because I'm actually really upset about this. Big tech is being such a fucking petty asshole. So I told you guys yesterday, and we talked about it. So big tech is one of the people that's been doing those anti-Christian spaces. He does like the co-host for that. And so basically, I've been listening to these spaces for months where I literally just go in, I listen to what they have to say. I don't talk in them. I don't really want to talk in them. I think I've gone on stage like 2 times and it was to ask a question. Then I went right back down and I didn't really engage in it beyond that. And so apparently big tech doesn't want me listening to these Twitter spaces if he's the co-host, because for the last 2 effing nights, I have been listening to the Twitter space and everything's fine. And then Big Tech comes in the Twitter space and he gets made co-host in the Twitter space and he kicks me out the last 2 nights. I thought it may have been an accident the first time. I was like, did someone hit a wrong button? What happened? Why did I just get booted from the Twitter space? I was literally just listening. And so I kind of gave him half of the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, maybe this was a glitch. I don't know, but I kind of figured he kicked me out. And then last night, the same fucking thing happened where I've been listening to this Twitter space for like an hour or so. He comes in, he gets into co-host. All of a sudden, I get kicked out of the fucking space. And then I found out that he blocked me on Twitter when I haven't even really interacted with him. And so, because he blocked me on Twitter, if he's already the co-host of the Twitter space, I can't even join the Twitter space to listen to it. Now, I guess I could listen to it under a sock account, and I probably will end up doing that when I'm on just like my computer with a browser or something. But I mean, can we talk about the fact that this is bullshit? Can we talk about the fact that I'm literally just trying to listen to a Twitter space and he's having all his Pisces feelings about it? Can we just talk about the fact that I don't even talk in those Twitter spaces? I literally just listen to them and he is so in his feelings that he can't stand to be in the same space as me. After I've tried to apologize to him ad nauseum when I don't even really think everything was my fault. But I don't know if I can listen to those Twitter spaces anymore. And I'm really sad and it's really stupid. And he should cut the bullshit and he should unblock me so I can listen to those fucking Twitter spaces. I'm not even interacting with you, asshole. You know? I feel like I was just too nice. In retrospect, I was just way too nice in this situation. In retrospect, I was like, he's a Pisces. You need to coddle his feelings. Otherwise, things are going to explode. But apparently it's just going to explode anyway because you're trying to be petty about like me listening to a Twitter space because you want to play video games but not actually do anything on the space and I can't be there listening to other people talk. It's so fucking stupid. I was too nice to him. I realize now that was my mistake. It will never be made again because, quite frankly, he hasn't given fuck off about my feelings about the situation every time he's been overtly cruel to me on the internet. Every time he has sent me absurd DMs that I never released out of the goodness of my heart because they would have made him look like, a really bad person. I feel like I coddled his feelings way too much, and that was my mistake, and here we are. Can't even be in the same Twitter space. But whatever. It is what it is. If the universe deems someday, many days, after many days, someday the universe will smile down and big tech will decide that I'm allowed to listen to a fucking Twitter space again, and maybe the clouds will part and he will get out of his feelings and he will figure it out and he will stop being a dick on the internet because all I wanted to do was listen to a fucking Twitter space. Can't do it. Can't do it. Men and their feelings. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about it. I'm not going to complain about this every day, but I really had to complain about it one more time when it was confirmed for me that yes, he did boot me out of the Twitter space just because he doesn't even want to be in the same digital fucking space because that's how in his feelings he is. But I'm the woman, remember. I'm the annoying woman. I'm the annoying psycho woman. Okay. All right. All right. All right. Whatever. Anyway, let's go to our thing. Men, I tell you. All right, we are learning about white supremacy today. We are learning about the left's new definition of white supremacy. If you have not yet mounted the like button, please go ahead. Where's my thing? Why isn't it doing the right one? That one? That looks right. So if you haven't mounted the like button yet, please go ahead and mount that like button for me. I would appreciate it. And let me just get the thing here. Turn the chat comments on so you guys can see them. If you have something to say about the presentation or you have a question about what they're talking about, please let me know in the chat. We will answer all questions and we're just going to listen to what the left has to say and we're going to think about what that means for this dystopian nightmare that we continue to sink into every day. Where did the term whiteness come from? That's actually a great question. So what the left would tell you, hang on, let me take a drink. What the left would tell you, and remember, on this channel, We are not interested in what is the literal truth about the situation. What we are interested in is what does the left believe? Because whether or not what the left believes is the truth, it doesn't actually matter. They believe it is the truth, and their behaviors will follow what they believe. And so people are going to have to like rein in their debunking when I explain what the left means by the term whiteness, because you have to remember this is not based on your definition, this is based on their definition. And so their definition is going to dictate their beliefs, their mindset, and their behaviors. So that's what we're trying to understand here. What the left believes is the term whiteness was invented when slaves were brought to the United States, slaves being private property that were owned by the bourgeois, the capitalist. Remember, capitalism to the left is private property ownership. Slavery to the left is the ownership of people as private property. They believe slavery, which was created by capitalism, because you can't have slavery without capitalism, slavery created systemic racism in America, or systematic disparities in outcomes based on race, based on whether you are property or whether you are capitalist. So when they're saying the term whiteness, I once heard the Denver Communists say, and I have a clip of them saying this, the term white meant people who did not work in the sun. The term black meant people who worked in the sun. So when we're talking about things that it might sound like skin color, but they're really talking about a social relation. They're talking about positionality. Who is the oppressor? Who is the oppressed? Who is the property owner? Who is the owned? Who is the bourgeois? Who is the proletariat? That's what they're talking about. And so this is why you can see articles like the one in the Los Angeles Times, Larry Elder being called the black face of white supremacy. This is why we have Cheryl Harris, who wrote the original paper, Whiteness is Property, flat out saying that black people can be white too. Being white is not about skin color. Being white is about private property ownership and capitalism. You cannot decouple racism and capitalism. This is why I have a poster of Angela Davis saying essentially that racism and capitalism are inextricably linked. This is why there's literally a book called What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism. That's where it came from. They believed that white people did not exist until slaves were brought to America, and then white people were invented to distinguish them as a property-owning class. So, hope that helps. Might make things more confusing, but that is actually what they believe. All right. Let's dig in. Let's get this party started. And if you guys have questions throughout, please just let me know.
I'm your host, Chris Brown. A couple of months ago, we spoke to HLT Kwon and Dylan Rodriguez about state addiction,
No. What did I just say? No. Listening is fundamental on this channel. We don't make shit up here. The term whiteness means property owner. Property owner, private property, capitalism. That is what it means. It does not mean competence. It means private property owner.
Counterinsurgency and anti-democracy, and how we might live otherwise in times of fascism. Today's episode picks up many of the threads from that.
Well, guess what? You can have as many feelings as you want about what the definition is, but that doesn't change what the definition is. So if you want to get all in your feels and you want to go have a good cry in the corner about how dumb you think it is, go ahead and do it, and it will change literally absolutely nothing.
Conversation. So to that end, it is my great pleasure to be joined on the show today by Alana Lenton, author of the new book, The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. The book offers a critical analysis of the ways in which racial capitalism reproduces itself. Building on the work of Cedric Robinson in particular, Alana traces the often chaotic and contradictory restitching of the racial regime. Through the attacks on critical race theory, the whitelash against the teaching of histories of slavery and colonialism, the counterinsurgent capture and institutionalization of anti-racism, indigeneity, and decoloniality in the interests of Zionism and settler colonialism.
Indigeneity, okay.
And how the war on anti-Semitism reforms white supremacism at a time of acute genocide.
The war against anti-Semitism reforms white supremacism at a time of acute genocide. You still think it's about skin color?
In our conversation today, we touch on all of this and more. As ever, podcast listeners can get 40% off the book through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. And some of the other books that we talk about in today's episode by Anthony Lerman and by Cedric Robinson are also discounted for podcast listeners. You can go to plutobooks.com/podcast reading for the full list of titles. Okay, without further ado, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is Alana Lenton on Radicals and Conversation. So, Alana, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me on the show today. It's a real honor to get to talk to you and discuss your new book, The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. As we're recording this, it's about 5 days before the official publication date, so it's brand new, hot off the press, and a really, really sort of insightful read for me anyway. A lot of the ideas contained within it were new for me, so I really enjoyed getting to engage with it. I guess let's just start off, if you could introduce yourself briefly for our viewers and our listeners. Maybe say a little bit about your professional background and your political background, why you're writing on this kind of subject, I suppose.
All right. Well, thanks firstly very much for having me and for engaging with the book. So a little bit about myself. So obviously my name is Alana Lenton and I'm a scholar of racial counseling.
Hang on. Your best strategy right now is going to be to ask questions because you obviously don't understand what you're talking about. It's okay to be new at something. It's not okay to be belligerent in my chat. When they say white supremacy, they mean capitalism. It is a distinction about class. It has nothing to do with skin color. When they say white privilege, they mean capitalist privilege, which is the privilege of owning more private property and having more private wealth than other people. We do smart people commentary here. We don't do dumb shit posting, okay? If you have questions, that's fine. But this is a classroom, bro.
Capitalism and anti-racism. My background really is in anti-racism activism and research going back, well, the research part going back over 20 years now. I've worked around various countries within Europe and have now been based on Gadigal Wongal land in so-called Sydney, Australia for the last 13 years. That's me.
Okay, so I guess it makes sense then to talk a little bit about
I don't know why you guys are getting the idea that you can just shitpost in my chat, but we're going to put a stop to this right quick. You're in a classroom right now. You're in a classroom. Either you're here to learn or you can go somewhere else. If you have questions, we can answer them. But to say whiteness is not a meaningful term ignores the explicit definitions that I've already given you. I don't like wasting my time when people aren't listening. I have given you explicit definitions about what they say it means. Those definitions are completely consistent. They are consistent with everything the left believes. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's a meaningless term. And every time you guys do stuff like this, you allow them to win and make more progress. What we do here, no, you weren't. No, you weren't. You're going to fucking listen. When you say it is a meaningless term, that means you are literally learning nothing. The goal here is to learn what they believe. Shitposting and making jokes. We make jokes on this channel, but we don't dismiss what they believe and we don't call things meaningless because every single thing has meaning.
Genesis of this book project, right? Because you read in your prologue, I think, to the book that you were told, and I think probably by some of us at Pluto, that the book as it was originally conceived, which I guess was more closely orientated around the battleground of critical race theory, might have seemed sort of out of date or passé by the time it was published. And so what I found really instructive in reading the book was how you demonstrate that, the sort of attacks on critical race theory and what we see in sort of like anti-woke politics, the culture wars, and, a large part of what you talk about in the book, which is the anti-Semitism side of things. All of these things might seem sort of unique, new, novel, sort of distinctive, but they're all manifestations of the same sort of enduring phenomenon, which is the racial regime. And so, critical race theory has this sort of enduring sort of analytical relevance, I guess. Could you tell us a little bit about where the book sort of came from and then how it ended up, as you kind of, went about writing it, I suppose? What changed, that kind of thing?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I put that little quip in the preface. People will see, or the prologue, I think I've called it. People will see when they read the book. But it is quite serious, I think, as somebody who's been doing this work for a really long time. I just knew when it was put to me, and I have to say it wasn't by people at Pluto, it was more generally, that, unfortunately, sadly, the so-called war on critical race theory, stroke war on woke, was still going to be alive, well, and
Hang on. The socialist definition of racist is capitalist, or people who uphold the capitalist system by having more private property and advocating for a capitalist social and economic model than others. When we're talking about racism on the left almost never talk. And by the way, don't think I don't know that you should fucking know this by now, because you've been around long enough to know this. And what you like to do is you like to ask me questions in different ways to try to see if I'm going to change my answer. And you're going to learn really quickly that I'm the most consistent bitch on the internet. So you can keep asking me these questions in different ways across multiple streams. You're going to get the same answer every single time. The left is never talking about individuals, which you should know by now. The left are not individualists. The left are collectivists. They are never talking about your individual skin color. They are talking about the collective, the system. Systemic racism means the system that upholds racism. Institutional racism means the institution that upholds racism. Both of those things mean capitalism. Well, this is actually a good question. The left has multiple definitions of anti-Semitism as well. I've heard them say that you can't be anti-Semitic against rich Jews. I've also heard them say that it is anti-Semitism to oppose the migration of brown people, even if those brown people are not Jewish. So hopefully they give us a definition of what they mean in this, because really they do have multiple definitions of anti-Semitism.
Kicking, at the time of publication, even if it took me a few years to get the actual book out. I mean, what was happening was that I published my last book in 2020, and that was called Why Race Still Matters. And the questions that I was engaging in that book were things that I'd been thinking about for a number of years leading up to that. And, one of the things that we were talking about in that book was the concept of not racism, or the idea that, we could explain away what were obvious and blatant acts of racism and racist discourses as not really being racism, that there was this idea that there's this kind of ordinary definition of racism that everybody understood. This kind of, the everyman can understand this, that somehow anti-racist activists were twisting this to mean something else, so that anything and everything could become racism. And at the same time, the same people who were proposing this were saying, actually, there's this new, different, and more, they would suggest, insidious form of racism, which is, basically what they don't call, but we could call so-called anti-white or reverse racism, which then became very, a hot topic. And as, the sociologist Mary Song said, we have to actually...
No, their definitions are never fluid. It's just a matter of you don't understand the language yet. You're still relatively new. You don't know all the language yet. So if the definition seems fluid, then ask the question instead of assuming it's fluid, because they are consistent on everything they say.
Locate what racism is in terms of its history, severity, and power, and not allow it to be relativized in this kind of way for the obvious purposes of white supremacy. So within that kind of same way of thinking, in 2020, shortly after the publication of the book, I noticed this moral panic about critical race theory, which culminated in, as I detail in the first chapter, Donald Trump's conference on American history, which he held at the White House just before the end of his first term in office. And then people started to respond to this.
The left is incredibly consistent, James. I'm going to bet you are new on this channel. Hang on, let me check. Channel activity. 0 comments on the channel ever. So James, you're brand new to the channel. You've never asked a question on this channel. If you think the left isn't consistent, it's because you don't know how to speak their language. So ask the question and I will answer the question, but they are incredibly consistent. You not understanding their language does not mean that they are not consistent.
And there were a number of, people talking about this in terms of a war. And in fact, David Theo Goldberg publishes a book, I think the following year or in 2022, called The War on Critical Race Theory. So what I, initially wanted to do before all...
I mean, if I'm being very honest about it, I think anyone with a working brain knows that the conservative narrative about anti-Semitism is bullshit. So yes, the left believes that the conservative narrative about everyone being anti-Semitic is bullshit. Quite frankly, they're right about that. They're 100% right about that. The left is not anti-Semitic. The left doesn't care if people are Jewish. They're not Jew haters. There are Jews involved all over the left. This conservative bullshit narrative about everyone is a Jew hater, all this stuff, it's wrong. It's just wrong. So that's probably what you're thinking about.
Of this was, or before other people started publishing on it, was to publish maybe a short, like essay-like book, just dealing specifically with this topic. And I did come against this this idea that, you know, by the time you've sat down, done the research, written the book, and it's published, nobody will be talking about this anymore. And it's obvious just in terms of the cycles that we've gone through, looking at, you know, previous decades, the whole idea of political correctness gone mad, or the various iterations of what Gavin Titley and myself in our book, The Crises of Multiculturalism, which came out in 2011. But that had its early.
No, this is not a stupid question. This is a great question for new people. Why don't they just use the word capitalist instead of the word white? So the thing is, number one, they actually do. They use the word capitalist all the time. The problem is that most people don't actually listen to the real left. So if you're watching things like stuff on conservative media like Fox News or the Daily Wire or the Blaze or Steven Crowder or any of these things, you aren't actually watching, libs of TikTok especially, you are not actually watching the real far left. You're watching conservative clickbait content, but you think it's the real far left because they present it as the far left. When you actually watch the real far left, this is a perfect freeze frame for her, they say capitalism all the time. So this is how we know the different definitions they have for all these words that generally speaking all mean capitalism, because they use the words interchangeably. And you'll be able to hear that as we make the way through the presentation. But more specifically, why do all these different words mean capitalism? Why does racism mean capitalism? Gender binary mean capitalism? Normativity mean capitalism? Colonialization mean capitalism? Imperialism means capitalism? Decolonization means removing capitalism? Anti-racism means anti-capitalism? Why do they have all of these different words that basically all mean the same thing? Because they're all different vectors of capitalism. So the race vector of capitalism is not the same as the gender vector of capitalism, is not the same as the environmental justice vector of capitalism, is not the same as the queer vector of capitalism, is not the same as the military and the police vector of capitalism, is not the same as the border vector of capitalism. These all mean capitalism, but they're different aspects of capitalism. Because capitalism, they believe, created all of these things. Race is a social construct created by capitalism. Gender is a social construct created by capitalism. Capitalism created all problems with the environment. Therefore, capitalism is the problem. Capitalism created borders. Capitalism created the police. All of these things are outputs of the capitalist system. And that is why they all lead back to the same place. Does that make sense? Let me know. The left is 100% consistent. The left, quite frankly, James, the left is a lot more consistent than the right is on free speech. The right are the ones out censoring people right now. The left are completely fine. So with all due respect, your job right now is to be quiet and listen unless you have a question. If you have a question, we're more than happy to answer those. But the question's got to be asked in good faith. And I have a feeling you're a troll account, but we'll see. We'll see. Let me just look in the chat. Looking over on Rumble. Hey, Tiffanel. Okay, let's keep going.
Earlier iteration in the 1990s that Cedric Robinson and other people have talked about in terms of the backlash against multiculturalism, which manifested in the United States specifically around the question of affirmative action, which then leads to the cancellation of affirmative action. It's final death kind of much more recently, but a long, slow death of any kind of attempt to redress racial inequality and discrimination within hiring or education or what have you. So these are kind of cycles that repeat. And as I was kind of having this back and forth about whether the book could find its home somewhere. And then Pluto eventually came on board. I was also developing my interest in Cedric Robinson's work.
So I would be more than open to answering this question. I literally just answered it earlier in the stream, though. You may not have been here yet, but I literally answered this exact question. So why is the term white used? White represents people who do not work in the sun. It represents the property owner, the property class. Black represents the property, the owned, the proletariat. These, again, are social constructs created by capitalism, just like men and women are social constructs created by capitalism. But again, I literally just went through the whole spiel earlier in the stream, so please rewind and go back and watch that. Or you can refer to my Substack. I've talked about this many, many, many times. There are so many clips on this, but please don't make me say it again now, because I just did. Thank you.
Beyond, the engagement with his 1983 book, which most people who know his work have engaged with, that's Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition, and starting to look into his other work, particularly, the volume that Pluto put out, edited by H.L.T. Kwan, and from that discovering his 2007 book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, in which he introduces the concept of the racial regime. And then the racial regime, which I can go on to explain if you like, becomes the kind of mechanism for me to think through this recursive recapitulation, or as Robinson puts it, recalibration of racialism in various guises through. He's interested specifically in the medium of cinema in that book, but we could argue about media more broadly. And while my book is not more narrowly focused on media, obviously these questions of representation, so how racial capitalism is actually recapitulated, how it's actually spread across the globe, through representations, through discourses, it becomes very important to the idea of the racial regime.
Well, yeah, you've already mentioned Cedric Robinson, and you've
for the people over on Rumble complaining about Rumble comments not being on the screen, take it up with fucking StreamYard. Take it up with StreamYard. I can't integrate Rumble with StreamYard, so take it up with StreamYard. Tell them to add Rumble. The moment they do, I will integrate Rumble comments on the screen. It's not an issue I can manage. I'm covering the far left here.
Started talking about the racial regime, so I think that's probably the next place to go. Listeners might be familiar with the term, but could you tell us a little bit more about Cedric Robinson's idea of the racial regime and how you're kind of developing that in the book, I guess?
Yeah, so in the book, Robinson wants to talk about how, as he puts it, at the end of the 19th century, a new racial regime coheres through finance capital and the sort of the shift that you see towards American imperialism and colonialism outside of the confines of Turtle Island, having been completely invaded and settled, with the indigenous population completely dominated, towards the outside. And what we see is the kind of the 20th century, the embarking on the 20th century iteration of the West, led by the United States, and this kind of
I agree.
new imperialist guise.
I agree.
And through, as he puts it, the invention of the Negro, which he locates much further back. In fact, he locates it within the 16th century and Shakespearean representations of African people. He then takes that forward to this much later stage, and through the development of Hollywood and the particular representations of Black people that it comes up with, in order to be able to justify and legitimate a form of super exploitation of African people on which racial capitalism in this at this stage of history relies.
I'm sorry, what? Did it just say that capitalism relies on basically making Black people look like they deserve to be enslaved in Hollywood? Capitalism relies on racism? See where this is going?
A much later stage, and through the development of Hollywood and the particular representations of Black people that it comes up with, in order to be able to justify and legitimate a form of super exploitation of African.
No. You're going to answer your own question now, because I answered this for you earlier. What does being an anti-racist mean? This is only for Klump. I only want his answer. This is not the correct answer. And this makes me believe that you weren't listening earlier to the several times I've already explained this. So now you're going to answer your own question. Being anti-racist means what? Exactly. So why are you mentioning race at all in your question? You know what the answer is, and you're fucking around to try to get me to give you a different answer. I played this game for fucking years, bro. Don't do this shit. You know exactly what the answer is. You didn't need to ask the other question. You're doing it to fuck around. You've been doing this a lot. I don't appreciate it.
African people on which capitalism, racial capitalism in this at this stage of history relies. And this is, but the way in which he conceives it, as with everything in Robinson's work, due to the importance of the Black radical tradition, is that this is always met with resistance. So representations of African people as subordinate, ignorant, whatever it may be, is always met with resistance by those very people.
Another question, is BLM connected to the left? And if it is, does BLM use the leftist definition of white? Every single person on the left knows that whiteness means capitalism. Whiteness is a reference to systemic racism. It is literally only people on the right who do not understand this. So yes, BLM understands this. BLM was fundamentally an anti-capitalist project. BLM wanted to eradicate the nuclear family as an attack on capitalism. BLM was run by Marxists. BLM's primary goal was defund the police, abolish the police. That is fundamentally a Marxist leftist project because they believe the police are the managers of private property and they have to abolish the police in order to abolish capitalism. BLM was 100% about overthrowing the capitalist system to institute a Marxist society. Everything BLM did was about that. It was always about capitalism. I understand why you think it was about white skin color and black skin color, but it really wasn't. And this is why we listen to the left's actual language, because when you listen to the left, they tell you that. Why do you think they care about you understanding their language? Why do they think that why do you think they care about what you think? You're not involved in their subculture. You're not part of their group. You're not part of their clique. You are not their friend. You are their enemy. So why do you think that they care whether or not you understand them?
People. And so the racial regime, as he sees it, is constantly has to be readjusted in reaction to this pushback from below, which is in constant kind of tension with these representations. And so the racial regime, I mean, he talks about it differently. There's the racial regime, which is the...
Well, we're not in Japan. We're in the United States. Why, like, Japan has no bearing. Bro, we are talking about the United States. Please restrict your questions to the actual topic.
Formulation I've tended to
But yes, generally speaking, any property owner is going to be considered white by this framework. But again, we are talking about the United States. Why do you think they care about recruiting you? They don't care about recruiting you. They have your children. They have the public schools. They have the colleges and universities. They have the news media. They have the nonprofits. They have literally every institution in this country. Why do you think they care about recruiting conservatives who don't know anything about them, don't know what they believe, don't know how to speak their language, seem to be opposed to everything they say and do? They don't need to recruit you. They're just going to go get your kids, bro. Why do you think all the kids are being transed and queered in schools? Why do you think anti-racism and critical race theory ended up in schools? Why do you think your little darlings are being taught how to be protesters and activists in public schools today? Yes, even in red states. Why do you think they don't need you?
He also talks about them multiply as racial regimes, because you kind of get this idea that they change historically, but rather than changing wholesale, there's always this kind of, as he puts it, kind of new stitching on old cloth, where he uses a lot of these stitching metaphors, where this kind of these same ideas, these same motifs are kind of put together differently to meet the needs of the particular context and time that they're operating in. And so that fits very neatly with what I was saying earlier about how we see these same themes, these same backlashes coming up and again and again, there are motifs that are taken from earlier debates that were there, for example, in the 1990s or indeed the 2010s with the crisis of multiculturalism, but they're kind of stitched together differently. And that means that we're constantly made to believe that we're in crisis mode, that there's this new big crisis that we're confronted by and that we have to respond to. But actually, the idea of this recalibrating racial regime allows us to see how there's always this chaotic nature to it. There's always kind of this scrambling for kind of meeting the challenges of the day, and therefore setting us up with new problems. But that can also be a strength because we can tap into the history of what we already know that's happened in order to struggle against the challenges that we're faced with, even at times of, as Cherise Bridenstelle put it in her endorsement, the time of monsters that we seem to be living through today.
You've probably already said it or hinted at it, certainly, that we're not talking about a sort of top-down imposition from like the state or institutions necessarily. I mean, we are talking about that, but not just that. This is something that is much more amorphous, sort of complex, chaotic, certainly. Could you elaborate on some of this? And I guess, like, what is it that a racial regime requires in order to be effective or successful? Because as you've kind of suggested,
a racial regime,
what they're dealing with is like fictions that are like obviously sort of untrue, but there's a huge amount of effort that goes into sort of reproducing itself. So yeah, how do they maintain themselves or ensure their success, I guess?
Okay, so I just want to note something real quick. They've talked several times in this presentation already about the idea of reproduction or something reproducing itself. I just want to make sure people understand what that actually means. That's a reference to social reproduction theory, which the left is the left's idea of how the capitalist society perpetuates. Social reproduction theory basically means that social systems will continue to reproduce themselves until they're disrupted. So that means the capitalist system, the capitalist economic model, and the capitalist cultural model will continue to reproduce itself in our society unless it is overtly disrupted. And so by disrupted, we mean with protests, with queering gender, with queering the nuclear family, with mass disturbances, with riots, with things like that. They're trying to disrupt the reproduction of capitalism with all of their destabilization efforts.
And I think the point is that what we're doing is trying to anchor this historically. So part of the work that I do in the book is also to revisit those debates about when can we date race in terms of
when can we date race?
Idea.
You mean it was created?
And this is actually important because it helps us to see, what is being done and in the name of what is it being done? Because a lot of the debates that we see on the left with regard to race are about whether or not we wouldn't be better off jettisoning this idea altogether. It's obviously a fiction. I mean, nobody, I'm least of all the person who's going to agree that race is somehow kind of an ontological fact. I don't agree with that. However, it obviously has an enormous political force that we've been contending with for centuries. So therefore, it's a powerful idea that cannot be just simply discarded. It's not enough.
Race is a political force. Race is not an ontological fact. Race is a political force. How interesting.
Altogether, it's obviously a fiction. I mean, nobody, I'm least of all the person who's going to agree that race is somehow kind of an ontological fact. I don't agree with that. However, it obviously has an enormous political force that we've been contending with for centuries. So therefore, it's a powerful idea that cannot be just simply discarded. It's not enough for us to kind of imagine it out of the reality for it to become something of the imagination or something of the past. And so therefore, we need to think very clearly about how imbricated the ideas of race, the productive, generative ideas of race. I tend to talk about race as
no. Race is Are you not listening to what this woman is saying, James?
Doing something rather than being something in order to emphasize its productive and generative nature, right? And the production and reproduction of kind of forms of domination and exploitation and strategy.
Listen, race is integral in the reproduction of forms of domination, property owner, and exploitation, the property. Listen.
We need to think very clearly about how imbricated the ideas of race, the productive, generative ideas of race. I tend to talk about race as doing something rather than being something in order to emphasize its productive.
Race is about doing something, not about being something. That means it's not about skin color.
Race is doing something rather than being something in order to emphasize its productive and generative nature, right? And the production and reproduction of kind of forms of domination and exploitation, and stratifications. As Robinson puts it, the tendency of Western civilization is to differentiate, not to homogenize. And this is, again, a recursive process that happens, that has to be kind of constantly worked upon. But what Robinson gives us in Black Marxism is this location of race in an earlier history to what most race critical theorists tend to place it at. So we tend to talk in terms of, modernity. Of course, that's differently dated for many people, particularly decolonial theorists. That becomes the moment, which is kind of distilled as a moment. It isn't really one, of 1492. And of course, the invasion of the Americas, which dovetails with, the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and so on. So these kind of two things going in tandem with each other. But Robinson dates this earlier. So his kind of location of the birth of what he calls racial capitalism within European feudalism is very important, because he talks about kind of movements of migration within Europe, very similar to what we see today. So people migrating for work and burgeoning capitalism, with a burgeoning capitalist class, using this migration and kind of fitting different groups of people to different forms.
Do you guys hear how much they're talking about capitalism? Kind of seems like they're talking about capitalism. Kind of seems like they created a whole word for the exploitation of Black people called racial capitalism.
These kind of two things going in tandem with each other. But Robinson dates this earlier. So his kind of location of the birth of what he calls racial capitalism within European feudalism is very important, because he talks about kind of movements of migration within Europe, very similar to what we see today. So people migrating for work and burgeoning capitalism, with a burgeoning capitalist class, using this migration and kind of fitting different groups of people to different forms of labor. This isn't necessarily fixed in stone, but this tendency to kind of differentiate between people based on their utility for the economy is something that begins then, he would say. Somebody then, who I also discuss in the book, like Geraldine Heng, would, in her book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, puts this at an earlier period. So she looks very much at the Middle Ages, as does Satnam Verdi, who's somebody I've discussed in chapter 5 in relation to kind of the invention of the Western subject, or Homo Europaeus, and the importance of this for racial capitalism. What I'm trying to say by this is that we have to understand the kind of the long-standing nature of the centrality of race and racial thinking for global processes, for world history, basically, and for the kind of global order that we have been endowed with to this day. And therefore the racial regime as the kind of force, if you like, that constantly recapitulates this and kind of puts it in different terms and allows it to cohere around.
She just said it, you caught it. To race is to differentiate people on their utility in the economy. Let's find that. Sorry if we're gonna have to go back a minute, but I missed it. There it is. There it is. So they're talking about, so again, going back to her talking about capitalism, the capitalist class, they're going to say the purpose of race, something to this effect, is to differentiate people on their utility in the economy. Are you an owner, or are you the owned? Are you the bourgeois, or are you the proletariat? Are you a boss? Are you a worker? That's what this means.
To what we see today. So people migrating for work and burgeoning capitalism, with a burgeoning capitalist class, using this migration and kind of fitting different groups of people to different forms of labor. This isn't necessarily fixed in stone, but this tendency to kind of differentiate between people based on their utility for the economy is something that begins then, he would say. Somebody then, who I also discuss in the book, like Geraldine Heng, would, in her book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, puts this at an earlier period. So she looks very much at the Middle Ages, as does Satnam Verdi, who's somebody I've discussed in chapter 5 in relation to kind of the invention of the Western subject, or Homo Europaeus, and the importance of this for racial capitalism. What I'm trying to say by this is that we have to understand the kind of the long-standing nature of the centrality of race and racial thinking for global processes, for world history, basically, and for the kind of global order that we have been endowed with to this day. And therefore the racial regime as the kind of force, if you like, that constantly recapitulates this and kind of puts it in different terms and allows it to cohere around the topics of the day, whatever they might be. And they can be various. And part of what I show in the book is that it's not just, crises around, critical race theory or woke, but also from the other side, the ways in which anti-racist ideas can be incorporated within hegemonic institutions like corporations or universities, so from seemingly an anti-racist perspective, in order to kind of, domesticate or to dilute the radicality of the critique against the racial state and against racial capitalism. These also form part of
the anti-racist critique is against the racial state and racial capitalism.
Racial regime. And this is not a kind of conspiratorial argument, but if we understand the long-standing nature of race as a political force, an idea that drives...
Again, race as a political force. The oppressor versus oppressed. The establishment versus the revolutionaries. The capitalist versus the Marxist. That's what they're talking about.
Kind of, the global order, then we can understand the need for this constant process of recapitulation or recalibration.
Mm. Yeah, I think that is one of the really interesting ideas that kind of emerges in the book, that a racial regime might be composed of like antagonistic or conflicting ideas, that it can accommodate these ostensibly sort of anti-racist ideas, because it seems sort of counterintuitive, but obviously you kind of draw it out really nicely, how these kind of progressive and liberal sort of values or iterations of the racial regime are sort of rubbing alongside, but ultimately serving the same ends as the more reactionary ones. I mean, you've kind of mentioned institutional examples like universities there. Could you just say a little bit more about some of the ways we see this kind of liberal orientation sort of popping up and diluting the radicalism of truly sort of anti-racist sort of ideas and movements?
Yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
In the book, I'm kind of...
Gunther got it. Yes, exactly. Race is inextricably tied to class in the same way, because classes are created by capitalism. Capitalism creates the hierarchy of the oppressor versus oppressed. Race is just one of the ways they create oppressive hierarchies. Well done.
A little bit resistant to what's become, I guess, a received notion on the left, that there are various forms of kind of liberal anti-racism that have been co-opted by, for example, corporations that have used, woke in order to be able to sell products more easily. I mean, we're already seeing that, having it's basically not a thing anymore, right? Very, very quickly, just as soon as it kind of arose or emerged with the so-called racial reckoning of 2020, we saw this surge in kind of, acceptance of or embrace of diversity by corporations from, I talk about the case of Disney and so on in the book. That's kind of dissipated, right? So, and that just goes to show the degree to which we have to be very, very careful to make these sweeping assumptions about how nefarious the co-optation of anti-racist or liberal anti-racist ideas by capitalism or indeed by institutions can be. I talk about the case of Disney and so on in the book. That's kind of...
You guys couldn't hear me. We simply can't talk about we simply can't have our anti-racist ideas co-opted by capitalism. Sorry.
Corporations from, I talk about the case of Disney and so on in the book. That's kind of dissipated, right? So, and that just goes to show the degree to which we have to be very, very careful to, make these sweeping assumptions about how nefarious the co-optation of anti-racist or liberal anti-racist ideas by capitalism or indeed by institutions can be. So, but what I show in the book is the kind of the tension that exists at the same time. And I do this through the very contemporary example of how, the kind of the war on anti-Semitism, which is a term that the Palestinian German scholar Anna Yunus has talked about, how that functions within institutions such as universities. That's the kind of the example that I use the most in the book. But what you have is this kind of tension where at the same time actors, so Zionist actors supported by universities, have used ideas that come directly out of critical race.
No, don't bring this bullshit in here. Hitler was doing something completely different. Hitler was fighting Marxists. Hitler still believed in private property. We are not going to be one of those retard channels that says, do you know who the Nazis were? They were the socialists. They're just like the left. They were not like the left at all. We hinge into reality here. No. What Hitler was doing has nothing to do with what these people are doing, other than Hitler was actually against this stuff and he was trying to fight it. I'm not saying Hitler was a good guy, obviously worst person that ever lived, but again, we live in reality here. We don't live in made up bullshit.
Theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism in order to enforce a kind of a mandatory Zionism that, if it is not kind of colluded with by students, staff, and the general public alike, there will be direct repression. So you've got these two kinds of things going in tandem, right? So it's never assured, that's what I'm trying to say, there's never assured that wholesale these ideas will be incorporated and that's it, they've been completely captured, this idea of elite capture, right? There's always this kind of tension with which the script can completely flip towards this kind of much more repressive and carceral notion. So, and this is where we have to be very careful about what we can accept. So one of the things that has been used, and this is an obvious example that many people will be familiar with, is that something like hate speech laws or whole idea of a hate crime, which is an idea that Dylan Rodriguez has critiqued very much, can be used in order, so ostensibly something that kind of polices racist language or racist acts can then be used in order to repress anybody who speaks out against, for example, Zionism, but also other forms of kind of repressive, fascistic, practices of the state. So, and we can see this also with the climate movement, the kind of very heavy state.
Just so everyone is clear about why she is equating Zionism to racism. Again, if we understand that whiteness means capitalism, that they're talking about the property class, the owner class, you have to understand that they view Israel, the Zionists, as the settler colonists, the capitalists, who stole the indigenous land from the Palestinians and privatized it under capitalism. Whereas when the Palestinians had it, it was under the collective caretakership, so it wasn't privatized. So the reason the left is opposed to Israel, the reason they're opposed to Zionism, is because they view Israel as the capitalist oppressors. That's why they call them the settler colonists. It's not because they're Jewish. By the way, they view the United States in exactly the same way. The United States are also the settler colonists. It's exactly the same as Israel. That's why they want to overthrow the government and abolish the Constitution, because it's built on settler colonialism.
Repression, how those kinds of laws that are ostensibly progressive ideas about stopping vilification, right, can then be used in order to repress any kind of speech or action that goes against, in this case, the mandatory Zionism that is writ large at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely talk some more about that sort of element of counterinsurgency and the capture of language, which is one of the chapters in the book. One thing that I guess we've alluded to, and many listeners may not need this elaborated, but could you just draw out the distinction between, racial capitalism on the one hand and the racial regime on the other, because they sound related, but they're obviously distinct. Could you just clarify that for us quickly?
Yeah, so I mean, the kind of analysis of racial capitalism that I use in the book or in my work more generally is that developed by Cedric Robinson in his book that I mentioned earlier, Black Marxism, that most people will be familiar with. There are other versions.
Well, no, it doesn't mean anything. You don't see Ibram X. Kendi anymore? Do you want to know why you don't see Ibram X. Kendi anymore? For the same reason you don't see Robin DiAngelo anymore. They became problematic. How the left operates is the left has a whole stable of people. They've got activists, they've got authors, they've got academics, they've got people writing books, they've got people out there giving talks, they've got people running centers at universities. They have thousands of these people. some of these people are more famous than other people. When someone on the left gets really famous and then becomes problematic because they're saying a lot of crazy shit in the media, do you know what the left does? Removes the broken part, throws it away, replaces it with someone else doing exactly the same thing that you just haven't heard about yet. So is it a good sign that we're not seeing Ibram X. Kendi anymore? No, it doesn't mean anything. It means Ibram X. Kendi got removed from the leftist matrix, thrown away, and he's already been replaced by someone else. You just don't know who they are yet. Same with Robin DiAngelo. Removed, thrown away, replaced with other people. You just don't know who they are yet because they're not famous like they were.
Of racial capitalism, especially those developed by South African Marxists or somebody like Neville Alexander, also a South African anti-racist freedom fighter, etc., or freedom thinker. And so they're somewhat different, if not related, to the way Cedric Robinson produces it. So in Black Marxism, his point is that what he calls racialism, so again, to return to this tendency, as he puts it, of Western civilization to differentiate and not to homogenize, is central to the ability of, you know, the West to reproduce itself or to impose its order across the globe through practices of enslavement and obviously colonial.
You got to understand that the language that the left speaks comes out of academia. Leftists are led by people who come out of academia. They use this language in the colleges and universities. They use this language in their meetings. They use this language in their papers. They use this language in their manifestos. They use this language in their books. The reason you don't know the language is you have not been integrated with their subculture within academia or within their activist subculture where they talk about a lot of these ideas. You have to stop thinking about it as they're taking a word you know and changing the definition. What you need to understand is their language is completely separate than your language. You're just confused because it sounds like English. It is not English. They are speaking a different language that has developed entirely separately from the language you know. So they're not going in their head. I know people think white means skin color, but really it means capitalism. That's not what they're doing. It has always meant capitalism for them. Always. And if you don't believe me, pick up the book I wrote. It's called A Brief History of Racism, where I literally go back to the invention of the term racism and I follow it all through modern day. And it has literally always meant capitalism. Always. The left understood this. The right did not. And listen, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad if you didn't go to college. The reason I know this is I went to a lot of college. I did a lot of college. And then in addition to doing a lot of college, I also worked at colleges and universities for 10 years. So it's no shame if you don't know this, but you've got to understand, if you haven't gone to college, if you haven't been involved in their activist subcultures, you just don't speak their language. They are speaking a different thing. They understand all of it because this is literally what they grew up in. Okay. So part of the reason we listen to them is so that everyone can learn to speak their language in an immersive experience. That's what we're doing. You're learning how to speak their language. If it sounds foreign to you, that's because it is. But if you ask questions in the chat, we can break it down for you. And once you understand a couple of things, you're going to see everything differently.
Colonialism and Western imperialism. And so he says it's not possible.
Yeah, this is also another good point. This language is primarily in the humanities, the social sciences, the liberal arts. That's not to say it hasn't gone into like engineering and math and stuff like that too. It has, but primarily, like if you're an engineering student, you might not encounter this. If you're a math student or like, you know, a hard science or something like that, you might not encounter as much of this. But if you're in like the liberal arts, you're absolutely encountering this.
Possible to divorce capitalism from racism or to merely think of them as, you know.
What did she just say? Can I have everyone needs to stop typing. If you are typing something in the chat, if you are looking at something else on the internet, I need you all to put down your phones. I need you to listen to what this person's about to say, all right? Is everyone listening?
Its order across the globe through practices of enslavement and obviously colonialism and Western imperialism. And so he says it's not possible to divorce capitalism from racism or to merely think of them as, existing in some kind of symbiotic relationship or kind of mutual back scratching relationship, which is the way that we often talk about them. So we'll say, racism is a kind of a tool of the bourgeoisie that divides the working class. That's kind of a typical, prototypical Marxist position. But also just saying something like all capitalism is racial capitalism doesn't really get to the heart of the matter, because it doesn't really explain the fundamental centrality of the idea of naturalizing differences between human groups, how important that is in order to be able to really enact capitalist domination. Because by setting up groups as being kind of opposed to each other or each kind of intrinsically connected to a form of labor or to the ability, for example, to enslave them, and reproducing this as natural and recurring, that this is how you're able to actually extend capitalism across the globe. So that's kind of the
Was that enough proof for people who didn't yet believe that whiteness means capitalism and capitalism is a reference to race? Does everyone understand? Does everyone understand? Do we need to go back and watch the clip again? I know there was a lot in there. It was messy, it was complicated, but she used the term racism synonymously with the term capitalism like 5 or 6 times in a single clip. So I hope everyone was paying attention and understood that. Does everyone understand? Capitalism itself is a system of domination. Capitalism is the only system of domination. Capitalism is the system that creates all other forms of domination. That's what slavery was. Let's go back and listen again. And by the way, I write about Cedric Robinson in my book, A Brief History of Racism. I write about him extensively. He is one of the main people that was responsible for the evolution of the term racism in the first place.
Produces it. So in Black Marxism, his point is that what he calls racialism, so again, to return to this tendency, as he puts it, of Western civilization to differentiate and not to homogenize, is central to the ability of the West to reproduce itself or to impose its order across the globe through practices of enslavement and obviously colonialism and Western imperialism. And so he says it's not possible to divorce capitalism from racism or to merely think of them as, existing in some kind of symbiotic relationship or kind of mutual back scratching relationship, which is the way that we often talk about them. So we'll say, racism is a kind of a tool of the bourgeoisie that divides the working class. That's kind of a typical, prototypical Marxist position. But also just saying something like all capitalism is racial capitalism doesn't really get to the heart of the matter, because it doesn't really explain the fundamental centrality of the idea of naturalizing differences between human groups, how important that is in order to be able to really enact capitalist domination. Because by setting up groups as being kind of opposed to each other or each kind of intrinsically connected to a form of labor or to the ability, for example, to enslave them, and reproducing this as natural and recurring, that this is how you're able to actually extend capitalism across the globe. So that's kind of the version or the analysis of racial capitalism that I tend to go with. Racial regimes, on the other hand, are the kind of the mode through which racial capitalism, or the natural order that racial capitalism presents, how that is represented through a variety of media and forms and of discourses, cultural forms.
By the way, I just want to make this clear. One of the racial regimes she's talking about is Israel.
Forms, again, media, film, whatever it is, but also how it's represented through the kinds of language that institutions use to represent kind of their approaches to tackling racism. So anti-racist programs, whatever it might be, there are many different kind of iterations of the racial regime. They're not, I mean, again, Robinson's focus is on film, and we could extend that to media, but I'm trying to take that beyond
a lot.
Those kinds of.
I'll tell you, it takes about 15 years of practice, and I don't even have to look at my hands anymore when I knit, and I worked hard for that skill. It took me years to do that. I focused on it. I practiced. I fucked up a lot of knitting. It took about 15 years. Not to do that specifically. That took a couple of years, but 15 years to knit that fast.
There's a question which I think actually you pose in the book, which is why so much energy is invested in attempting to either, annul the teaching of accurate histories of colonialism and slavery, or to contain it in very sort of circumscribed ways within Western curricula. Is this kind of all part of how a crucial dynamic of the racial regime is that it's incompatible with a discoverable history, of itself? Yeah, I'd just be interested to hear a little bit more about why history is so important. And maybe this is something kind of we might move on to talking about critical race theory, but why is it such a locus of kind of energy and attention for the recalibration of the racial regime?
Yeah, so I mean, the discussion of history, which comes about in the second chapter, which is on history and the technologies of white forgetting, is the centrality of, the teaching of history, or let's say public discussion of history as well, for those kinds of panics around critical race theory. So critical race theory is really like a basket term for talking about all of the things that the right thinks are wrong with talking about racism in general.
So
of course,
true.
critical race theory
So
doesn't
true.
mean anything. They don't know what critical race theory is. And
So
it's kind of
true.
irrelevant,
They
as
don't.
many people have pointed out, to the subject. They just cottoned onto something and they thought that would be a goer, and it was really successful for the likes of Christopher Rufo, who's the person who's generally seen as having fired the first shots in the war on critical race theory, as I put it. But it kind of goes together with this war on woke that then extends to attacks on LGBTQIA plus people, etc.
They believe capitalism is the enemy because capitalism creates all oppression, capitalism creates all domination, capitalism creates all human suffering. That's why. You can get started with one of my books, A Brief History of Racism. That's a good one to start with. It's pretty short. It's pretty easy to read.
Etc. Right?
Link in the description.
But the focus on history kind of connects to a much more long-standing issue that the right has had with any attempt to try to redress the dominance of a Western and Eurocentric account, a colonialist and a racial colonialist account of the sweep of history, one which tries to maybe say that, yes, there may have been things that happened in the past that were less than savory, but the past is best left in the past. We are on a road to progress, which is seen as kind of inexorable. And we must all get on board the same train, and any kind of attempt to hark back to what happened historically, be it in terms of the enslavement of African peoples or colonialism and so on, would be to kind of insist on an impossibility of unity in diversity in the present. So that kind of, general way of looking at things is quite well known. And we've seen an absolute over recent times. But again, it's not new, but I think it's been particularly within the context of the so-called attempt to decolonize universities or learning, or decolonize the curriculum.
So what they mean when they say decolonize the university or decolonize the curriculum, okay, so decolonization is removing the oppressive force of capitalism, okay? They believe that the universities have been colonized by capitalism. The administration is capitalist. This is why the administration is calling the police on the students when they're taking over libraries and setting up encampments and that sort of thing. Do you guys remember several months ago when a group of students at Columbia took over the library at Columbia and they renamed it like the People's University of some Muslim name? Does anyone remember this? Or you can think about on the student encampments, they actually have these things on the student encampments when they've been setting up like tents and stuff called the People's University. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? So when the students took over the library at Columbia and they said, we are decolonizing the library and setting up the People's University of some Muslim name in honor of the indigenous people, and they raise their fists in the air. That means they are trying to remove capitalism from the university by organizing a teaching effort outside of the capitalist system that is just for the oppressed people. That's what they're talking about. They believe the universities are fundamentally corrupted by capitalism because the primary job of the university is to produce workers for the capitalist system to help people get jobs after graduation. And because of that, they believe that the entire system is fundamentally corrupt. And they don't mind destroying the universities, by the way. People don't understand this. They think the left controls the universities, and they do, but the left controls the academic aspects of the university. The academics are the Marxists, the academics are the socialists, the administration are the capitalists, the administration are the bourgeois, the administration are the problem. The administration are the ones that are trying to force the academics to help people get jobs after graduation. What could be more capitalist? The left works significantly harder than the right. Not only does the left work significantly harder than the right, the left volunteers a lot of their time to do organizing. So I wouldn't say they don't want to work. That is what we call a bullshit right-wing narrative or a bullshit conservative narrative. The left works all the time. This is part of their identity. This is part about who they are. They don't want to find jobs within the capitalist system because they want to overthrow the capitalist system. Has nothing to do with work, though. They work all the time. They're organizers. They're activists. They're always planning something. They're far more organized than the right on any given day. So they are working. They're just not working in the way you want them to. Let's see. I think I saw another question. This has been going on for 100 years, and no one's done anything to stop it. So at least 100 years. They don't believe in most leftists in the United States are not Maoists. They reject Maoism, they reject Stalinism. That's not to say they all do. Some of them don't. Like the Party for Socialism and Liberation is pretty Stalinist and Maoist, but most leftists in the United States fundamentally reject Stalinism and Maoism because they believe it's a corruption of Lenin and the Russian Revolution. There is a splinter on the left between the Marxist-Leninists and the Stalinists and the Maoists. They don't get along, they don't like each other, they don't work together. So yeah.
Which goes back to sort of the mid-2010s. And then, of course, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, and all of the movements for Black Lives and the explosion of that across the globe, you get a real kind of energy on the right to kind of backlash, or as many people would say, white lash, against any kind of attempt to think critically about history and how it's taught, and how we need to kind of redress that in order to be able to challenge, right, dominant accounts. Now, the way I'm looking about,
you're saying this because you're still confused about it being race. They don't care about race. They care about capitalism and only capitalism. So this has nothing to do with they're trying to divide white people and black people. It has nothing to do with that at all. They don't care about skin color.
At this within the context of the book, in terms of how the racial regime is recalibrated, history becomes such a focal point because how we think about racism in the present really connects to these questions of time, right? So always going on about moving beyond the past, or moving on, or can't you just get on with it, or can we just not, let bygones be bygones, is very much connected to this idea that racism is a thing of the past. And we have this also being kind of reiterated on the so-called left, or in progressive circles. Well, we'll say things like, oh my God, but it's 2025. I can't believe we're still dealing with X, Y, and Z. And that kind of way of thinking about things really kind of says very clearly, it's a very clear.
You guys really have got to unlearn your conservative bullshit talking points. The left works, okay, let me lay this out for you. The left works significantly harder than every conservative group put together. The left is constantly working. The left is constantly organizing. The left is constantly making phone calls, creating plans, organizing protests, trying to fundraise, doing this, that, and writing books, writing papers, writing manifestos, creating educational events for each other. They are constantly working. To say that they don't have resilience is absurd when you understand how much they work. And if you don't understand how much they work yet, it's because you've bought into a conservative bullshit narrative. Literally, no one uses the word tankies except for YouTubers, and so we don't use that. The left does not use that word. They don't define themselves as that. The only people who use that word are people like Vosh and Hassan Piker, and those are not real socialists at all, in any way. Exactly. Zoran Mandami is going to become the mayor of New York City because the DSA in New York City worked for it. They worked you want to talk about working hard? The DSA in New York City brought in 20,000 individual donations to Zoran Mandami to get that nomination. That's just for the primary. The Republican brought in less than 900. The DSA in New York brought in literally 20 times the amount of donations that the Republican brought in. Okay? Can we start to let go of our favorite fucking talking point, which is the left is lazy? No, they're not. They just don't have the same values you do. They're working significantly harder than you. This is why a DSA member is about to become the mayor of New York. James, I'm starting to think you're just not smart enough to be here. I'm starting to think that you're just not smart enough to be here, James. I hope you prove me wrong on that, but we don't allow retards on my channel, bro. I don't care. No, no. Don't bullshit a bullshitter. You're responding from a conservative perspective. This is not a student affairs perspective. I worked in higher education a long fucking time. You are responding from a conservative perspective based on the media that you watch and the influencers that you listen to. It doesn't matter what you think it means. What matters is what the left believes. Yes, he did get young voters. They registered a ton of young voters in New York. All right, let's continue.
Indication of how somebody perceives what time actually is and how time actually works. So, Western thinking, very much opposed to indigenous thought, for example, sees time as this kind of linear progression, right? So we start somewhere and we end somewhere else, and we're always going forward. And in that vision of things, racism should be a thing of the past. But what the message that actually sends is that you should not be talking about this because we were supposed to have moved on. Now, colonialism, this idea of the civilizing mission was all about treating, so the West treating.
Hang on, we have a snarky comment over on Rumble. They think they're really owning the libs over on Rumble. This is Frosty. So you're saying that once they cash their check, they consider they made fun of capitalists, or they made from capitalists, they don't mind destroying a country because of capitalism. Yes. Yes. So what this person is saying is the left works capitalist jobs and they get paid in capitalism, but you're telling me they still want to destroy capitalism? Yes. It literally says they're allowed to do this in the Communist Manifesto. They have to work in the capitalist order in order to survive under capitalism, in order to have housing under capitalism, in order to eat food under capitalism. Therefore, yes, they are allowed to have a capitalist job under capitalism. They are allowed to have an iPhone. They are allowed to have a computer. They are allowed to have a car. They're allowed to have all of these things. They're allowed to make money. They're allowed to spend money as long as they are acting in service of the revolution by trying to overthrow the system. They're still allowed to engage in they're allowed to sell books. They're allowed to sell tickets at events. They're engaging in the revolution within the environment that they're in to overthrow the system. But fundamentally, just because they have a capitalist job and they get a capitalist paycheck, it doesn't mean they believe capitalism is a good system. They believe capitalism is fundamentally oppressive, fundamentally exploitative. They believe capitalism causes all problems in the world. And so they might be cashing that capitalist check, but yes, they are still trying to overthrow it because they think everyone will be better off if they overthrow it. Hope that helps.
The peoples that it colonized as childlike and needing a Western hand in order to pull them into history. So they exist outside of history. They need to be pulled into history. And this is kind of presented very much as a gift that was bestowed upon colonized people. And so any kind of attempt to actually talk about the ongoing nature of coloniality is seen as a kind of spitting in the face of this gift that's been bestowed upon you, right? So all of this leads to a kind of a vision of history, which, as many people have pointed out, like I'm thinking about Michel Rolf-Trouillot is like one of the most famous examples, this kind of silencing of the past that's very, very kind of, being discussed, by many people. But what Robinson brings to this debate, which I tried to inject into my discussion of this, is that, and he says this in Black Marxism, is that for any kind of new theory to be developed, which basically means any kind of new ways to meet the challenges that we still face in terms of racial capitalism, we actually need what he called new history. So history has to be written again, and it has to be written from a perspective that is cognizant of what has purposefully been left out. And this doesn't mean simply including left out perspectives, which is kind of what's happened with the attempt to decolonize the curriculum, or in Australia where I'm based, to indigenize the curriculum. It's kind of like an adding in. So we have what's there, and then we can listen to these other voices, we often call them. And this is kind of a patronizing kind of tenor to that. What Robinson is saying, that we need to entirely rethink what we mean by history. So what's the epistemology that's driving how we do history? And that's what he talks about, for example, in his essay, Notes Towards a Native Theory of History, that this history has to be from the perspective of those who are dominated and whose histories have been entirely left out. So it's not...
This is the basis of critical race theory, okay? Is when they're teaching critical race theory in schools, when they're teaching anti-racism in schools, what they are saying is, we are teaching the history of the oppressed. We are teaching the history of the proletariat. We have not learned the history of the oppressed and the history of the proletariat because we've been teaching the history of the dominator, the oppressor, the bourgeois. So that's what they're doing, right? They believe the histories of the oppressed proletarian have been left out, and they need to integrate them back into the educational system in order to wake people up to being part of an oppressed class. Listen again.
This is kind of a patronizing kind of tenor to that.
Yes.
What Robinson is saying, that we need to...
Precisely. Yes. This is the basis of pedagogy of the oppressed. That is exactly right. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is Paulo Freire. It is one of the seminal socialist Marxist books about about utilizing education in order to indoctrinate people into this left-wing ideology. Very good.
To entirely rethink what we mean by history. So what's the epistemology that's driving how we do history? And that's what he talks about, for example, in his essay, Notes Towards a Native Theory of History, that this history has to be from the perspective of those who are dominated and whose histories have been entirely left out. So it's not a question of merely including them, for shifting our entire gaze. And there's a lot of resistance to this. So in my discussions of, for example, the 1619 Project, which I carry in chapter 2, which is the New York Times project, many people will be aware, which tries to relocate, where you can kind of situate the so-called birth of the United States, which Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was the editor.
As a reminder, your feelings do not matter. Your opinions do not matter. The purpose of this is to understand what the left believes. Your psychological diagnosis of them doesn't matter at all. They're winning, you're losing. They're winning because they don't give a flying fuck what you believe about their psychology. They just keep going and organizing and doing whatever they want to do. And you guys capitulate on like, oh, the psychology of relativism and blah, 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 blah. And then you have fucking internet debates and you don't do anything about it. So this does not matter. Thank you to Renan for the 5 gifted channel memberships. Let's see who got a channel membership. Let me see. Sean got one. Dracos got one. Boss Bully Boy got one. Megan got one. Hi Jen got one. Congrats to everyone who got a channel membership. Thanks, Renan. Appreciate it.
That really situates with enslavement, with the first arrival, as she puts it. The date is slightly fudged, but anyway, the first arrival, she would put it, of African peoples or enslaved peoples to be enslaved on Turtle Island.
Oh, hang on. Oh. What do you think is the hardest part about people learning to take the left seriously? They have to overcome every single lie that they've ever been told about the left by right-leaning influencers and people who believe they understand the left but don't. So, I mean, it's really simple. This is why I get so pissed off every single time someone in my chat says they don't have jobs. They do have jobs. Their jobs are to do this. But if you're coming in with the mentality, they don't have jobs, they're mentally ill, they're lazy, they're stupid, they don't even know what capitalism means, they don't even know what they want. These are all conservative bullshit talking points that just perpetuate an absolute ignorance and apathy about who these people are, what they care about, what they're doing, how they operate in the real world, how serious of a problem it is. If you think someone is lazy and stupid and mentally ill and doesn't know what they want and doesn't have a job, do you take that person seriously? No, you probably don't. So every single time a conservative lies and says, they don't have jobs, they're stupid, they're lazy, they abort all their babies, they're mentally ill, they're narcissists, they're cluster B, it's like, what do you think that's going to cause? It's going to cause an entire population that doesn't take these people seriously. Another factor, of course, is the constant conflation of Democrats and socialists and Democrats and communists. Because again, it's like, you got Elon Musk, Donald Trump, every major conservative influencer running around going, Kamala Harris is a communist, Joe Biden is a communist, the Democrats are the communists. Well, guess what? When you conflate two extremely different groups, because real communists and socialists hate the Democrats, they shit talk them all the time. When you conflate the two groups, you actually allow them to make more progress because everyone's eyes are on the Democratic Party and not on the actual communists and socialists. So the actual communists and socialists get to operate completely unopposed. They have no opposition. The right is not an opposition. Conservatives are not opposition. Conservatives don't even know who these people are. So these people get to operate completely unopposed, no one paying attention to what they're doing, and you got Elon Musk and Donald Trump going, Democrats are communists. You got every fucking Republican going, Democrats are communists. We have to defeat the communists. Kamala Harris is a communist. And in the meantime, you have the actual communists and socialists protesting Kamala Harris, talking about how much they hated her and were never going to vote for her. They were doing this all throughout leading up to the 2024 election. So those are the biggest initial barriers, is honestly the amount of bullshit that comes out of conservative media and conservative influencers, the amount of bullshit that people believe. And listen, it's like this is the hardest thing because it's not your fault. I'm not saying you specifically. I'm saying anyone who believes these bullshit lies, it's not actually your fault. You have been lied to by the people that you trusted to inform you. And I'm really sorry, man, because I was lied to them. I was lied to by them at some point too. And it sucks. But getting people to understand that the people that they entrusted to tell them the truth have actually been lying to them for a really long time because those people either didn't care about the truth. They either were perpetuating a bullshit narrative that they were paid to perpetuate, or they just didn't bother to do their due diligence. It could be any one of those three. It doesn't actually matter because they still lied to an unbelievable amount of people. And that is the biggest barrier in terms of people taking the left seriously, is the amount of lies that they've been told by the conservative right. Once we get over that hurdle and people understand how much bullshit they've been told, then people can start going, okay, I really need to start at the beginning now. Because again, that's another big thing to chew off, right? Because it's like, you're telling me that I don't actually understand the left at all and I have to go all the way back to the beginning and start again? Yup. And a lot of people don't want to do that. And in case people think I'm being too mean, I went through this entire process live on the internet. So I went back to basics live on the internet and had to learn this live on the internet. You can go back and watch my earlier streams when I was learning it. There was a time when I didn't want to learn this stuff either. This is why I spent a lot of time yelling for a couple of years. I was really fucking pissed off about it. There have been a lot of people in my chat who've had to go through the same process. But it's like, people come in here and they're like, can you just make a 5-minute video about it? Can you just make a 10-minute video about it? Your videos are too long. I don't want to spend the time watching it. I don't have time for this. It's like, I can't teach you to unlearn everything that you've picked up and teach you a completely different framework in 5 to 10 minutes. I can't do it. I'm sorry. That is not possible. So those are the biggest challenges. And once we get past those challenges and people actually start listening to what the left is saying, it tends to get a lot easier after that. But getting over that hurdle, getting over the cognitive dissonance, getting over the fact that they've listened to people for years who have lied to them, that is a really, really, really big hurdle. You think maybe those right-wing influencers are being paid to send people off? Oh, yeah. Yes. They make a lot of money in lying to their audience, guys. This is why. Don't trust anyone, and I include myself in this. Don't trust anything that anyone says on the internet. Most of them are liars and grifters that will tell you whatever they need to tell you in order to get your money and to get you to share their content. That's just reality. This is why I only use primary sources. You never have to take my word for it. You will see the primary source evidence. I can't fake primary source evidence. I take nothing out of context. We always watch the full clip. We always watch the full video. You can be sure that you are getting the full context. I'm going to break it down and tell you what I think the language means, but ultimately you're going to be able to listen to for yourself, and you're going to be able to decide, Karlyn, I agree with you, or Karlyn, I think you're full of shit. But you're going to have access to the primary source evidence here. So don't trust anyone on the internet that's not showing you this stuff, is generally my rule of thumb. And that includes me. If I'm making a claim and I don't have primary source evidence to support it, which, by the way, I always do, challenge me on it. Honestly, you've got to start getting in the habit of don't believe a single fuck off thing anyone tells you on the internet. Not a single thing. Let's see. All right, let's keep going.
The debates around that, and this is notwithstanding the problems with that project, which I allude to in the book, but notwithstanding that, the backlash against it is very much about this idea that history should only be told from a particular perspective, one which kind of repeats received narratives, because if you were to do otherwise, this would entirely shake the bases upon which a certain vision of, in this case, the United States has been founded. And this would lead to kind of social disarray, social chaos, and so on. And really what the attack on the 1619 and other types of projects or other kinds of attempts to do this work of evolving a new history is a wholesale attack on Black, Indigenous, and anti-colonial historians who are seen as illegitimate. And that's how I think we need to see the entire...
Well, I know, right? The irony of him coming into my feed going, fatty, fatty, fatty. It's like, Andrew, you've got a couple extra pounds as well, bro. I'm not going to be the one to say it. I'm not going to call people fat. I think that's very low brow. I'm just saying...
war on critical race theory, such as it is, it's an entire and wholesale attack on Black, Indigenous, and anti-colonial thought, or any kind of attempt to develop this new history that Robinson talks about. And that's why it's not really about critical race theory.
Absolutely. And just to say, I mean, I found the chapter on time, time as a tool of racializing power, as a playing a key role in reproducing racial capitalism, and this idea of
She has a whole chapter in her book about how time isn't real and time is just about reproducing racial power. Are you shitting me? Are you shitting me? Is this a nice little treat that we've been gifted? This is going to be the intro to the show later with Jennifer. I'm going to be like, Jennifer, did you know that time isn't real and it's just about reproducing racial capitalism? Again, excuse me?
About. And that's why it's not really about critical race theory.
Absolutely. And just to say, I mean, I found the chapter on time, time as a tool of racializing power, as a playing a key role in reproducing racial capitalism, and this idea of white time, and therefore
white time. The whites have our own time now. We have our own time. This is like queer time. We learned about queer time or crip time the other day. There's queer time, there's crip time, and now there's white time. Wow. Hang on. I gotta take a screenshot. The idea of white fucking time.
This new history that Robinson talks about. And that's why it's not really about critical race theory.
Absolutely. And just to say, I mean, I found the chapter on time, time as a tool of racializing power, as a playing a key role in reproducing racial capitalism, and this idea of white time, and therefore, the need, as Cedric Robinson puts it, for a new history. I thought that was really, really fascinating.
Yep.
And also, just as you've kind of said, that the dominant account of racism that exists already comprises its end, so that it's not just a time in the past, but it was like a mistake or something, an overreach or a diversion. And yeah, all of that was really, really interesting. I mean, you've touched on indigeneity there, I guess. Again, as someone that knows very little about Australian history, other than kind of a vague sense of the wrongs that have been perpetrated by the state, it was really interesting to read about the history wars, and also the co-optation and containment by the state of sort of indigeneity, indigenous resistance, how that's been.
Guys, what they're saying is, so for people who might be confused, time upholds capitalism because time is about keeping people on a schedule. And so if you are keeping yourself on a schedule, like think of like a 9 to 5 schedule, think of like the time clock when you're punching in and out. Time upholds capitalism by keeping people in a rigid structure of oppression based on white people time, essentially. Capitalist time. That's what they're saying. Hey, thank you. There are times where I doubt my own sanity, and then I watch moments like these and I'm reminded of my mental clarity. Yeah, I feel that all the time. That's real. Thank you.
Sort of diverted and depoliticized, again, through institutions like universities. Could you say a little bit more about either the history wars or some of the stuff around, indigenous resistance in Australia, just because many listeners, maybe like me, will not be so familiar with this material?
Yeah, so I mean, in the second chapter, I've mentioned the 1619 project. I basically have two main examples that I discussed. That's the first one. And the second one is the history wars as they were known, which is kind of like the idea that there was an attempt by historians, basically starting in the 1980s in Australia, like there were in other places as well, to write a more truthful account of history, as W.E.B. Du Bois would put it, one which really contends with the extent of settler colonialism and genocide of Indigenous people and how central this is to the entire existence of the Australian Federation. And so the history wars are kind of established or between sort of white progressive historians and right-wing white historians. So it's really a white landscape. And I used the work of the historian, author, and poet Tony Burke.
Excuse me? Are you talking about me growing my hair out? Seriously? Seriously. Wild how her politics changed and suddenly so did her hair. Almost like the whole thing. Who are you talking about, James? Are you saying, James, that I've never had long hair throughout my life? Because I promise you, James, I had long hair when I was a Democrat. James, did you know there was even but a brief moment where I was a blonde as a Democrat. I also had long red hair as a Democrat. We're waiting for you to explain yourself, James. What could you possibly be saying? Because I'm kind of thinking that your name might not actually be James. I'm kind of thinking that your name is Jill. I'm kind of thinking that you're a 500-pound shut-in stalker who has many, 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 many different accounts because you keep getting your accounts banned by coming into the chat and being just an evil, evil cunt and trying to do stuff like this. Wild how her politics changed and suddenly so did her hair. What a retarded fucking statement. We're waiting, James. We're waiting for your explanation. Please enlighten us on what could have possibly possessed you to post this, you 500-pound ugly fucking stalker. We're waiting, Jill. We're waiting. I knew it. As soon as this person popped up on the screen, I knew it. I have an intuition about these things. I didn't want to pull the trigger too quickly, but I knew it right up front. We're waiting, Jill. We're waiting. In fact, do you guys know that back in the day, on MySpace, did you guys know that MySpace actually had a pretty powerful blogging platform back in the day? We're talking like this is like the early 2000s. And I used to blog about politics on MySpace as a Democrat. I was getting hundreds of thousands of views like a day on that blog. That was actually pretty crazy. I was getting a ridiculous amount of views. And guess what? See, look at that. It's Jill. It's Jill, you 500-pound fucking whore. We knew it was you. Oh, there it is. This is the same girl who rocked a DEI workshop pixie cut. Yes, Jill. Yes. I have had long hair and I have had short hair. Actually, let me just pull this up just for our 500-pound fat ass friend here. We're going to have some fun. Hang on. Sometimes, Jill, I've had long hair and short hair in the same fucking picture. Hang on. Because I know what Jill here is talking about. Jill here is talking about an image that she saw from my Facebook page. I had a great pixie cut. After I had really long hair. Hang on. We're stopping to harass. This is a woman that's been stalking me for 4 years for people who are new. So we're stopping to browbeat and harass the woman who keeps... Oh, Jill is one fucking fat ass bitch. Let me show you. Hang on. Give me a sec. Because I know explicitly and exactly what photo Jill is talking about. You guys want to see how I really haven't aged all that much? You guys want to see this? Check this out. Hang on. Come on, photo. Uh-oh. It's giving me the spinny wheel of death. It's going to be back. Hang on. You guys want to see how much I haven't aged a day? Not a single fucking day. It's so great. Here it is. This is me in 2007, motherfucker! Almost 20 years ago. With very, very, very long hair. And then I cut it off one day. And I donated it to Locks of Love. And so I had both long hair and a kick-ass pixie cut in exactly the same photo. And I like to say that I think I've aged pretty well. So yes, fat ass Jill. You are correct that there was a time when I did have a pixie cut. And there was also a time when I had long hair. And guess what? I was a Democrat in both these pictures. So now, because you're obviously just a useless fucking bitch that's obsessed with me, that watches my streams every day, that wishes you could be a part of my audience, but I'm very sorry, fat ass stalker, you are not welcome here because you're a fucking psychotic lunatic, as evidenced by the fact that you're using the word butthurt and saying someone had a pixie cut and that means they had a DEI haircut. Are you fucking shitting me? You fucking retard. I was working in a military school when I had that haircut. Do you think that military school was a DEI school? I promise you it wasn't. Now we're going to ban you from the chat. Goodbye, fat ass. We'll see you next week when you come back with another account. Oh, you got her picture up? Hang on. Let me show you. Mizakan's got a great picture of Jill. Hang on. We'll show you what Jill looks like. For people who are new, I don't even know when he posted, but yeah, that's her. Yeah, that's her. That's the stalker that was just in the chat. I wish I was joking. I am not joking. That is actually her. What does having a pixie haircut have to do with anything? I have no fucking idea, but that was a really good haircut. I loved having short hair, man. But you know what? You know what the benefit of long hair is? I never have to get it cut. I never have to go get a haircut. It's great. I love not having to go get a haircut. I used to have bangs. Do you know what the worst thing about having bangs is? You have to go get haircuts all the time to maintain the bangs. Bangs suck. They suck. So, anyway. Thank you for that intermission, fat ass. We're going back to this now. Fun times. You never can tell. Never can tell what account that fucking stalker is going to show up within my chat. Never. Hang on. Gotta fix something. All right. Apologies for the disruption.
Who's an Indigenous man who has critiqued this because he talks about the need to understand that the history war really is a war, right? So it's not a war that's about academia and about how we, kind of write and read on these topics, but it's really a war for between a kind of a colonialist and an anti-colonialist or an indigenous-centered perspective. And he kind of takes to task the white progressive historians who, while at the same time want to present a more accurate account of history, do so kind of imminently with these other historians who they don't see as racist necessarily, even though they are obviously responsible for a very racist and right-wing politics that helped backlash against any attempt in public to really advance a more kind of radical response to colonialism, ongoing colonialism. So, there was a kind of a movement that was becoming more accepting of Indigenous people's demands for land rights, which was really emerging out of the kind of the Black Power era of the 1970s. By the 1980s, the late 1980s, and the bicentennial of and the invasion of the continent, you had a more kind of radical opening up led by Indigenous activists and organizers. And then you had this very distinct backlash against it at the same time that you had this kind of genteel, if you like, discussion among historians. And you can see this kind of playing out today in, again, I mean, Australia is part of the global landscape, also had its own kind of response to the George Floyd moment, which came on the back of this kind of slightly longer discussion about the need to decolonize and so on, which was happening within universities. At the same time that I have to say that in Australian universities, there's actually very little support.
This is actually from her book. Okay, so this is actually from the book of the woman who's talking about the white time. White time shapes the telling of history. It is the timelessness that helps construct the abstract universal human ideal, which the negatively racialized and colonized are positioned. Thank you.
Or any kind of critical work on race, indigeneity, and anti-colonialism, but there was sort of space.
And yes, Rayon Rumble says, Dr. K, weren't you a juggalo once upon a time? Yes, I was. Yep. I went to the ICP shows. I got covered in the Fago. It was great. There is nothing better than being at an Insane Clown Posse show covered in soda. It's so fun. If it sounds gross and sticky, and it is, but it's so fun. So yeah, I was. And I have no regrets at all in any way.
Is there, but very quickly, in a kind of a very similar way to the ways in which that whole context of the history wars was about kind of domesticating and academizing, if that's a word, the kind of critique, and taking it out of the streets, taking it out of the kind of the radical responses of, for example, as I say, following Birch, kind of Indigenous teenagers, for example, who were protesting against the yet another police murder of one of their own. Their knowledge of what the ongoing reality of colonialism isn't really kind of engaged with by those who kind of take this more academic approach. And again, in the much more recent times, with this attempt to redress the failings of kind of colonial representations of history, with attempts to make changes to the curriculum, which have happened in the curriculum. I'm talking about the school curriculum. It's definitely better, for want of a better word, than it used to be. It's certainly more attentive to Indigenous perspectives. But again, it's very noticeable that there are particular silences. So we talk about the atrocities of history and openly about the theft of land, the exploitation of Indigenous labor, genocide, cultural genocide, but Indigenous resistance and its ongoing nature. So not just something that happened.
Indigenous resistance is what the Palestinians are doing against Israel. Everyone understands that. Israel are the settler colonists who stole the land from the Palestinians. The Palestinians are engaging in a decolonization effort, indigenous resistance to the colonizers.
Of Indigenous labor, genocide, cultural genocide, but Indigenous resistance and its ongoing nature. So not just something that happened in the past, as some talk about the frontier wars, although not very centrally in the curriculum. It's acknowledged that there was a fight back by Indigenous people, but it's very much couched in historical terms. And the way in which the Indigenous presence is spoken of today is very much in terms of those themes of recognition and representation. So how can Indigenous people be adequately represented within a colonial state that remains kind of untouched by their presence? So they're allowed, if you like, to be there. But the entire basis of Australian colonialism and its kind of illegitimacy is not something that can ever be called into question. And the example that I used to kind of illustrate this was the recent failed referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament, which happened at the end of 2023 in October, just 1 week after Tufan al-Aqsa. So 7th of October and then 14th of October was this vote. And for many people around the world, I think the fact that the referendum failed, so 66%, I think, voted against, or 60, I can't remember if it was 61 or 66, voted against the this Indigenous voice to Parliament, and it was seen as a great failure.
Thank
and
you,
indeed,
Millie.
we have to openly admit that it failed because of the success of a racist no vote. So a vote very much kind of, whipped up by the right that argued that if this was to succeed, that non-Indigenous people, so the majority of population, would stand to lose. So literal things that were absolutely impossible, such as, your house will be taken away from you. So Indigenous people will just be like running roughshod all over the land and taking property back from non-Indigenous people, is something that was actually, successfully peddled by the right-wing media and the leader of the opposition at the time. But the problem with how this was contended with was that progressive, often white proponents of the Indigenous voice to Parliament, their argument was not, well, actually, there are serious questions about the fact that Indigenous people are being completely dispossessed on this continent, and that actually property and land does need to be returned to them. That wasn't even on the agenda to be discussed.
Someone just wrote, okay, so I posted the clip of Andrew Wilson throwing a massive hissy fit in my comments the other day on YouTube this morning. And someone just left this comment on that video. They said, Andrew Wilson kind of reminds me of the South Park episode where Cartman was trying to avoid having to fight Wendy. How is this guy fooling anyone? His actions scream that he's insecure and weak. I think that's a really apt comparison. Andrew Wilson is Cartman, and I am Wendy. And Andrew Wilson is desperately trying to get out of fighting me because he knows if he fights me, I'm going to kick his ass. So he's trying every which way he can to avoid the issue. It's so great. It's so funny.
The way this was contended with was that people were saying, don't worry, you can vote yes with comfort because nothing will change for you. And so the radical grassroots indigenous voice against the voice to parliament was making this point, but was very much kind of demonized on all sides, obviously by the right, but also by the progressive left.
Real.
And at the same time, there was this kind of strange dovetailing between that political campaign in Australia and the operations of certain Zionist actors within it. So I talk about the case of a particular former leader of a Zionist organization, Mark Liebler, who was very active within the Voice to Parliament referendum campaign and previously had been assigned to Indigenous kind of affairs by the former Prime Minister in the 1990s, who was well recognized as being very anti-Indigenous, John Howard, due to his work within kind of native title claims by Indigenous peoples. And without getting too much into the technical details of this for people who are not based here, it's quite difficult to understand. But the interesting part of this that I found interesting, and particularly around the kind of the coincidence of the placement in time of these two kind of events, so the Al-Aqsa flood and the Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum, was that Zionists in the Australian context were using this idea.
Look, Jill's back. Jill has another account. Jill is back. Hi, fat ass. Everyone shame Jill in the chat. Hang on. Let's just check, make sure. Yup, only chat ever on the channel. Jill's already created a new account. Let's be real. She ditched the DI pixie cut and drew out her trad wife YouTuber hair when she switched teams. The only reason someone would have long hair is if they want to be a trad wife. It's not as though they're too lazy to go get their hair cut, to the point where they even still have a whole bunch of split ends because they ain't going to get their hair cut. It's all because you want to be a trad wife. Okay, fat ass. Do you feel better now? Do you feel better, Jill? Guess what? You're still a 500-pound, ugly, shut-in, whale, obsessed fucking stalker that probably needs to spend your time going to therapy rather than watching every single stream that I do. Can you imagine being as pathetic as this woman? This is all she does. My God.
Yeah, that Jews are indigenous to Palestine, of course they would say Israel, as a reason or a rationale for why they supported the Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum. And so this notion, this trope of Jewish indigeneity is used in order to delegitimize the Palestinian freedom struggle. And therefore, when you can see the centrality of the role played by Zionists in this campaign and their ability to bring various prominent...
I think that's a really good question. Why are they so obsessed with me growing my hair out? Do you want to know why I grew my hair out? Do you guys want to know? It's a big secret. My husband asked me to because he hadn't seen me with hair this long before, and he asked me to grow it out. And conveniently, I didn't feel like going to get it cut anymore, so it worked out for both of us, didn't it? I've learned that growing my hair out is a pain in the ass when you're going through the awkward growth phase. But man, once you get it past that awkward growth phase and you don't ever have to go get a haircut again, it's like the best.
Indigenous voices on side to take a Zionist stance and to openly admonish Indigenous people who were advocating
Everyone's so
for
obsessed with my
Palestine in
hair.
Australia as being somehow anti-Indigenous, that Indigenous people should stand with Zionists, which obviously goes contrary to the politics of most Indigenous people in most places where they
real,
exist.
yo.
You know, grand
Struggle
majority
is
of them
real.
are pro-Palestine. Then it says something very particular about the kind of way in which themes of indigeneity and self-determination could be folded into colonialist agendas, right? And this is very much what you could see happening kind of in this microcosm of this Australian context and this, the politics of the Voice to Parliament referendum, which I don't think translated for an international audience who wouldn't have been able to be across this because it was a very kind of localized debate, but I think provides us with a very clear example of how indigeneity can be co-opted by powerful forces on the right, but also in more progressive circles, which I can expand on further if you like also.
Yeah, I thought this chapter was so interesting. There's a passage where you talk about Israel's sort of indigenous diplomacy and how the Zionist state's memorialization of indigenous soldiers who fought the First World War Battle of Beersheba allows it to position itself as a champion of Aboriginal servicemen against Australia's erasure of that history, which effaces the its own sort of settler colonial status that it shares with Australia, and replacing that with this fiction of shared indigeneity. Yeah, it's all really fascinating. But the idea that sort of, I guess, Jewish Israelis who are settlers can claim to be indigenous to Palestine or Israel, as you say, as they might put it, and indeed have a sort of greater claim than the Palestinians in that regard, it seems utterly specious. So, I mean, to your mind, how successful have these efforts been? Because the case study of kind of Australia is fascinating, but do you see this sort of gaining much traction on the international stage?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I should mention that the research that you quoted from is by Palestinian-Australian scholar Michaela Sahar. It's not my own research, but I thought it was just such an interesting example of the nefariousness of this. I also talk about in the book the establishment of an Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem that opened again around the same time. I think it was February 2024 they opened their doors. So, you know, in the context and the kind of complete full swing of this appalling genocide that we're still witnessing, this Indigenous embassy opens, and various representatives of various Indigenous nations from obviously the Anglo-settler colonies in the Pacific are gathered together within this opening ceremony of this Indigenous embassy. And one of the people who is very prominent at that event is Nova Perez, who used to be a sportswoman and a senator that later became a senator, was an active kind of proponent of this position that Jews are indigenous to Palestine, which she then equated with, you know, her own position as an indigenous person on this continent, on the continent of Australia. So actually, there is, I mean, is this a prominent view? I mean, I think that obviously we're witnessing what I hope to be the dying stages of Israeli settler colonialism, of the Zionist project. I don't think it's possible to see.
Just call for the eradication of Israel? Holy shit.
What I hope to be the dying stages of Israeli settler colonialism, of the Zionist project. I don't think it's possible to see that this is sustainable over the long period. I think we're already seeing a kind of, albeit far too late and far too slow, but a change in the approach to the Zionist entity in the current moments of acute genocide that we're currently witnessing. So I can't make grand statements about how important or how helpful this discourse of a Jewish indigeneity is for global politics. But what I want to say is that this has been fundamental to all settler colonial projects. So self-indigenization.
See, it's not just about Israel. It's about all settler colonial projects, including the United States. This is how you know this has nothing to do with them being Jewish. Aside from the fact that they're not saying anything negative about them being Jewish, they're saying Zionism, Israel is a settler colonist state. We do not believe in settler colonization because we believe that means capitalism, oppressor, bourgeois, stealing land from the indigenous people. Israel are not the only settler colonists. The United States are also settler colonists.
of colonizers within colonial contexts is writ large, right? So you can see it at work in the United States, in Canada. There's a lot of work that's been done on the politics of this. There's huge amounts of many examples of people being outed as having claimed to be Indigenous for many years and then being discovered to have no Indigenous heritage whatsoever. There's obviously kind of capital that can be brought to certain people in positions of quite significant power. So we're talking about, many academics, authors, artists, musicians of various kinds.
We already explained this earlier. This has nothing to do with white people, nothing. This has nothing to do with race, nothing. Has nothing to do with that at all. You got to get that out of your head.
Particularly, as I said before, in Canada, in the United States. And so, I don't think that it's helpful for us to think about this in psychological terms, although some people have approached it in those terms. It's much more important to see it in terms of, what it actually does for the colonial project, to be able to claim to be Indigenous to a land that you have colonized. Obviously lends a justification to that project of colonization. And I think Zionism takes it to a level that cannot be achieved by any of these other colonial contexts because, of course, of the manipulation of, a history, if you like, but a kind of a biblical narrative about Jewish existence in the area now known as Palestine. And that kind of lends it an extra weight. But the important thing about this, and the last thing I'll say about it, is what that idea has lent to nativist projects within Europe. Okay, so now we see European white supremacists refer to themselves as Indigenous and now being invaded under this, rubric of the Great Replacement by hordes of kind of marauding others, Muslims and other migrants that are kind of usurping the rightful place of the Indigenous people. And obviously, we know that indigeneity is a colonial relation. So Indigenous peoples, people who we think of as being Indigenous today, did not refer to themselves as Indigenous to anything before they were colonized. They were named Indigenous by their colonizers. And then indigeneity takes on a political tenor, in terms of, fighting back against colonialism and fighting for land rights and decolonization and so on. So for Europeans who are the instigators of colonialism on the world stage to then refer to themselves as Indigenous
Europeans are the instigators of colonialism. Again, that means capitalism on the world stage.
Of colonialism on the world stage to then refer to themselves as Indigenous is again this self-indigenizing, which is a project or a tool, a technology of racial colonial power.
I think this moves us quite nicely onto the sort of the last section of the book, which is about Jews in relation to whiteness and the creation of whiteness and how anti-Semitism functions in relation to whiteness as well.
Yeah, let's learn about that.
You mentioned already how the timing of the referendum vote in Australia came after October 7th, and maybe that had a big role in the outcome of that, and what people probably see as the threats, the existential threats kind of in that. I guess listeners will be familiar with the idea of Gaza being a laboratory, right? Where techniques of repression, pacification, surveillance, and much worse are sort of honed and then exported on the international market.
Yeah.
On this podcast, we've talked about the links between police forces, trainings and so on between the IDF. So we know that there's that kind of material component to the relationship that binds the West and Israel together. But it's really interesting to read sort of in the book how the West also sees Palestine not just as a laboratory in this sense, but also like an augury, right? What it needs to do to save itself existentially. Could you say a little bit more about this? Because I guess one thing you often hear is that, it's maybe like guilt over the Holocaust that sort of accounts for the absolute sort of lockstep of, Europe and the US with Israel. But
can you guys imagine what would happen if the left figured out the Holocaust? Obviously, the Holocaust was real. Obviously, it happened exactly like they said it happened. Obviously, gas chambers have wooden doors. Obviously, no less than 10 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Obviously, Jill is back in the chat, and I don't feel like arguing with her right now because I'm trying to make a point. So we're just going to ban her. Obviously, Hitler was the worst person that ever lived in the history of the world. No less than 10 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Worst event ever. He's burning in hell, all that stuff. But can you imagine what would happen if the left actually figured out like the Holocaust stuff and the JQ stuff, because the left already doesn't like Israel. It's not about them being Jewish, but they don't, it's about them being the settler colonists, but they like already really don't like them. And if the left figures out how Israel is using the Holocaust to genocide an entire people, and how they are using this in order to attack every BDS protester in the United States. If the left ever actually figured that out, that would be a very interesting development. I don't think they want to figure that out, but if they did figure that out, that would be pretty great.
I guess that misses something in that particular framing. So yeah, could you say a little bit more about these are more kind of existential things, the kind of stuff to do with the West's self-perception and...
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, you've put it quite well. It's a misnomer to presume that the West's support for Israel and the almost blanket, not just silence about the genocide, but the repression and punishment of anybody who speaks or acts against it, that this is somehow coming from a place of European guilt for the Holocaust, particularly homing in on Germany and the acute kind of repression that's happening there, and the almost kind of
because they just haven't. Because they just haven't. They're so close. They get so fucking close to it. It's like they circle around it. It's like they're poking it with a stick. I've heard them talk about this several times. They're so close to figuring it out, but they're just like not quite there, because they haven't fully grasped that the Holocaust was definitely, absolutely taught to us exactly the way it happened. So like they're this close. We just have to give them time.
For Israel, and the declaration just the other day by the Chancellor that Germany will always unconditionally support Israel. And the kind of the widespread nature of pro-Zionism, even on the ostensible anti-fascist left in Germany, makes it seem that because of the Holocaust, that the Germans are acting out of some kind of misplaced.
I mean, listen, can we be honest? None of us really wanted to figure that out. For those, if you haven't figured out the Holocaust yet, don't do it. Just don't do it. Someone told me don't do it when I was like, can you just like red pill me on the Holocaust? And they said, are you sure you want to know this? And I said, yes. And they said, are you sure? And I said, yes, because I don't do anything half-assed. But like, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, don't look into it. Just don't do it. Because no one really wants this information. This information kind of fucks up your life. It kind of fucks up every single thing you perceive about the world. Just don't do it. There's lots of reasons to not want to do it. But I do hope the left figures it out someday. But honestly, just don't do it.
Guilt. And I don't think that's completely absent, but I don't think it's enough to explain why it is that the West is so lockstep with Israel and so intent on allowing Palestinians to be genocided and for all of Palestinian supporters to be punished for simply trying to stop this in any way that they can or that we can. I think there has to be something more. And I think it's to do with the ways in which anti-Semitism has come to be understood for very, very particular political motives, to do with the persistence or the ability for the West to survive, right, in the face of a realignment of the global order that should have come after decolonization. And Zionism plays a particular function, I think, or the existence of the Israeli state plays a very particular function for the West in its own self-perception in this kind of post-decolonization era and within the context of Western imperialism, because it represents a kind of a distillation of the West and what needs to be saved or what needs to be preserved in the face of this kind of need. Again, I mean, to return to Robinson's maxim about needing new histories, which would actually, the upshot of developing this new history would be to completely upturn the world order. It's not just for, discussions, as I put it.
They're developing a completely new history to upturn the world order. They're literally rewriting history in order to try to facilitate their Marxist revolution. Listen.
in the face of this kind of need. Again, I mean, to return to Robinson's maxim about needing new histories, which would actually, the upshot of developing this new history would be to completely upturn the world order. It's not just for, discussions, as I put it at one point, like frolicking in the footnotes of history. It's about actually being able to challenge the system as it stands. And so then this existence with this selling of this poor, only democracy in the Middle East that is standing up against, barbaric nations, a nation of, survivors of genocide that have nowhere else to go, et cetera, et cetera. It's how the West perceives itself. Coming back to this notion of, these Europeans who are indigenous, who are being kind of usurped or attacked from the outside by marauding others, right? So then that leads me to how we think about anti-Semitism and what actually is the function of discourses of anti-Semitism or the idea of anti-Semitism in the present day. So, I think it's been problematic to talk about anti-Semitism as being weaponized, because that's to kind of minimize the extent to which the very idea of Jewish safety that needs to be defended at all costs, the function that plays for this entire idea of preserving the status quo or preserving the Western order. So I use what I think is an amazing discussion that Robinson, again, has in an essay called The First Attack is an Attack on Culture. And that essay is actually about the Black radical intelligentsia. The first thing that it had to do in forming its ideas was to attack, and he uses the word advisedly, the culture which establishes the quote-unquote Negro and replaces him or her with the African. So the Negro is the degradation of African people, and the idea that African people had no history, no culture, no tradition, no knowledge, etc. And the very first thing that Black radical intelligentsia had to do was to attack and destroy that idea. Okay, and he, in order to explain this, he uses he discusses Marx's, a very famous essay on the Jewish question. And he says, contrary to dominant perceptions of what Marx was trying to do in that essay, Marx was actually explaining that the essay, the subject here, the problem here wasn't the Jew, but German society in which the Jew existed and represented the problems of German society for itself. And so the idea...
James Lindsay just got totally flattened by this woman. James Lindsay's ideas around the Jewish question, Marx's on the Jewish question, just got wiped out by this leftist in like 2 sentences. I'm very sorry that you don't know what you're talking about and you're having feelings about. See, what's happening, Auditor, let me explain something. What's happening is you're experiencing cognitive dissonance because you're getting exposed to information that you didn't know before, and it's giving you feelings because you want to believe that white people are the poor victims of the world and that white people have always been abused. And don't take that fantasy away from me. Don't tell me it's not about white people. I know it's about white people. Do you think I've never seen anyone like you on the channel? So this has nothing to do with me not being nuanced. This has to do with you working through your feelings. Do not project your emotional baggage on me. Be a big boy, wipe your tears, and then listen to what they're saying, because it's very clear when you listen to them. If you don't want to hear it, if you want to stomp your feet like a little girl and blame it on me because I'm just a mean woman in the chat and you're going to tell me what's what, I mean, you can do that as a strategy. I don't think it's going to get you very far, though.
Problem here wasn't the Jew, but German society in which the Jew existed and represented the problems of German society for itself. And so the idea of the Jew, just like the idea of the Negro, invented by the German society for its own purpose, needs to be attacked and needs to be gotten rid of. And this is kind of what we're dealing with. So we need to attack and get rid of the dominant view of anti-Semitism, or this idea of this Jewish safety that needs to be protected at all costs, because only once we've gotten rid of this are we going to be able to actually push past what's at stake, which is, of course, the ability for genocide to be basically ignored or even condoned, as again, Germany puts it when they say that they will unconditionally back Israel even in the face of these absolute horrors.
Yeah, it's interesting how you write in the book that the war on anti-Semitism is meant to fail on its own terms, right? Because I guess if Jewish safety had been attained and we'd moved past that point, then there would have to be this kind of reckoning. But as long as Jewish safety cannot truly be secured, then the status quo remains intact.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk in the book as well about the definitions of anti-Semitism, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and that this is quite, we know it's a very problematic, highly politicized sort of term, but it's sort of amorphous, polyvalent by design as well.
Yeah.
And its role is to generate the anti-Semite that the West needs for its own reproduction. Could you say a little bit more about this kind of working definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA? And then, is it useful to attempt to sort of somehow replace this definition with a different definition of anti-Semitism? Because there's some interesting discussion in the book around this.
Yeah, thank you. So the IHRA definition is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. I don't go into too much detail on the entire history of it. For example, Anthony Lerman does that really well in another book that you published. And I actually get a lot of the details about it from that book. So that's really useful. But I think, again, as you say, it's very important to understand that the original drafters of the definition, I think, were trying to do something in good faith, which was to kind of acknowledge that there's a specific form, as they would have seen it, of anti-Semitism that might be slightly different to what it looked like historically. But I think at best, this is naive. And at worst, it's rather malicious, because it doesn't contend with the fact that there's a very specific history of this idea of a new version of anti-Semitism, which can be traced back much earlier to when the IHRA first came up with, well, it's not the IHRA that came up with the definition, it should be said. This happened within the context of the European Union, but let's not bore the listeners with the details of all of that. But it basically can be traced back to the early 2000s. So much, much earlier than this, in 1974, you have the publication by the Anti-Defamation League that more people know about the Anti-Defamation League today because of their, rather prominent place within the war on anti-Semitism. I mean, it's obvious that the ADL is a kind of a counterinsurgent pro-Zionist force today, but many people don't know the extent of its history in kind of being...
Hey, thanks for the super chat, Zed. I've been watching about a month now after Adam had you on. Left Speak makes a lot more sense now. Thank you. Vegans equal communists. What do you think? Well, sadly, there are a lot of vegans who are not communists. So I wouldn't say that veganism is synonymous with communism, but I do appreciate the super chat. Oh no, they have answers. They have answers. They have very clear answers. They have a complete vision for their society. They know how they want it to work. I've covered it many times before. I'm not going to go over it all now, but they absolutely have answers. The idea that they don't have answers is what we call a conservative bullshit talking point. It just means you haven't listened to the left enough. But keep coming back and you'll hear the answers.
Very, very prominently involved in the smashing of Black radical and particularly Palestinian radical thinking, going back at least to the 1970s, but also they had involvement in kind of the McCarthyism in the 1950s. So it has a very, very long history of getting involved on behalf of or in lockstep with the US state against any kind of radical forces. At the same time, it kind of advances itself as this kind of progressive organization that is involved in anti-racism training and education, particularly has a massive role in the development of thinking around hate crimes, which then gets kind of woven into law in very dangerous ways, as again Dylan Rodriguez has written and spoken about. But the point is that the ADL is behind the publication in 1974 of a book entitled The New Anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism basically advances this idea that anti-Semitism is no longer really a problem of elites, it's no longer really associated with the West, but that the real kind of source of contemporary anti-Semitism is among Arabs and specifically Palestinians. And that's where you get this idea that is now dominant, that anti-Semitism is rife among all proponents of Palestinian liberation, and this inability.
Wait, they're saying that Palestinians are inherently anti-Semitic? The ADL is saying that is that what they're saying? Hang on.
Gets kind of woven into law in very dangerous ways, as again Dylan Rodriguez has written and spoken about. But the point is that the ADL is behind the publication in 1974 of a book entitled The New Anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism basically advances this idea that anti-Semitism is no longer really a problem of elites, it's no longer really associated with the West, but that the real kind of source of contemporary anti-Semitism is among Arabs and specifically Palestinians. And that's where
in 1974, the ADL published a book that said the real source of anti-Semitism is not just Arabs, but Palestinians specifically. That's wild.
You get this idea that is now dominant, that anti-Semitism is rife among all proponents of Palestinian liberation, and this inability to separate between anti-Zionism, which is obviously, opposition to racist, fascist, and colonialist ideology and practice and an entity on the one hand.
Oh, so you're telling me that the idea that being anti-Zionist and being anti-Semitic is inextricably linked comes from this book that the ADL published in 1974?
Which is obviously, opposition to racist, fascist, and colonialist ideology and practice and an entity on the one hand, and any kind of hatred for or discrimination against Jews on the other hand. And, this idea that all Jews are represented by Israel, which is, of course, what Netanyahu has openly said, and what beyond that, what many people believe, right? That there is this kind of like affiliation, naturally occurring affiliation between Jews, wherever they might be in the world, and a belief in Zionism and a kind of a support for Israel. And so the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the definition itself is quite nonsensical, right? So it talks about a certain perception of Jews. So it's very, very fluid, not very kind of precise. As a definition, it doesn't really work. And it talks about certain kinds of tropes about Jews, but if we actually try to delve into various forms of racism, we can see that many, all forms of racism are build on these kinds of same narratives about negatively racialized people. That's simply how racism in general works. But a great effort is made, and generally in the West, a great effort is made to distinguish anti-Semitism as a very particular form of racism. And I would argue also, or I have argued, a prototypical form of racism, a kind of a blueprint for racism that apparently occurred earlier than other forms of racism, which is untrue, that other racisms are kind of built on or sit in relation to, right? So that's kind of one problem. So the very definition is a problem. But then there's 11 examples of potential anti-Semitism that are given. And these are the parts that are the most problematic, because 7 out of 11 of these definitions or these explanations or these examples are related to Israel and Zionism, and basically equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And these are the parts that have been kind of used by institutions across the board, from government to universities, local authorities, you name it, that have kind of included the IHRA definition, well, either included it in law or in policy. So, and
hang on. Breaking news. Congressional Republicans will introduce a bill to revoke the National Education Association's federal charter tomorrow. Holy shit. Are they actually doing something useful? Wow. Hang on. That's crazy. That's awesome. If that actually works, that's awesome. Disband the teachers' unions, abolish the fucking teachers' unions.
Most interestingly, I think, within things like diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, where one example that I give is from Macquarie University in Sydney, where they have, their EDI or DEI, whatever policy that it's called, and then the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is included there, but it's the only definition of any kind of racism that's included. So everything else is very vague. And then you have this one kind of concrete thing that sits in the middle of it. And this, of course, can be used in order to repress, and has been used. We've seen examples of this, has been used to repress.
Wait, other breaking news. President Trump says that the Epstein files are a made-up Democrat hoax. We got a good one. They're trying to abolish one of the teachers' unions, and we're like, yay! And then Trump says the Epstein files are a made-up Democrat hoax. And then we go, boo, bad Trump, no Trump, bad, don't do this, Trump. Well, this clip is from 6 hours ago, so.
Press academics and students that are acting on behalf of Palestine, because of the kind of the wielding of these examples rather than the definition itself, which, as I say, is very vague. So what I tried to say in the book, because you talked about other different definitions that have been kind of introduced to try to counter this. So one of the examples is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which is an attempt by a group of Jewish and Israeli academics to develop an alternative. I think they're not all Jewish, but mainly develop an alternative definition of anti-Semitism. But this,
yes, you can. Go
this
ahead.
definition has equally been problematized. For example, I mentioned Samir Abdel Noor and Mohanad Ayash, who are two Palestinian academics, who I think very rightly have critiqued this definition for being Orientalist and for completely ignoring Palestinians. So when you have a definition of anti-Semitism that is obviously being introduced in order to either support Zionism, in the case of the IHRA, or to contend with the problems raised by Zionism, and you completely exclude Palestine.
So hang on. When they say free Palestine, what do they actually mean? Is it about Palestinians or something different? This is a great question, actually. Like, being against the idea of races and nations and anti-capitalism. No, I totally get what you're getting at. So when they say free Palestine, they do actually mean free the Palestinians. They believe that Israel has stolen the land of the Palestinians and have colonized the Palestinians by keeping them, on like in their settlements. And basically that they think that what's happening in Gaza is a play to steal the land and build up, which they're not wrong about, by the way. But so they believe they do mean free Palestine. They do mean free the Palestinians, liberate the Palestinians, give the Palestinians back their land. However, they also mean a bigger picture, because free Palestine is not just about the Palestinians. Free Palestine is about all people who are oppressed. This is why you hear them say, like, queers for Palestine. Queers for Palestine means everyone who is oppressed in solidarity with the Palestinians. The queers are oppressed by capitalism. The Palestinians are oppressed by capitalism. We are oppressed by capitalism. Everyone's oppressed by capitalism. And so while they do specifically mean the Palestinians, they also mean this bigger picture of no one is free until everyone is free. We must all stand in solidarity with the oppressed in this case being the Palestinians. Hope that makes sense.
Palestinians from that discussion, then obviously it's a problem, because Zionism is a problem for Palestinians first and foremost, right? So obviously there's a problem there. But beyond that, what I try to do in the book is return to what Robinson does in that essay that I mentioned earlier, The First Attack is an Attack on Culture, in which basically he's saying that as soon as you accept the terms, what he means by this are the terms that are handed down by a dominant order, a particular explanation of things, then you kind of have kind of given up on any kind of radical approach or as I put it, kind of an abolitionist approach. So what I argue is that even requesting that.
Why them? Because Israel stole their land. That's why. They also believe the United States, this has nothing to do with the Jews. This has nothing to do with white. This has nothing to do with skin color. They also believe the United States are the settler colonists here because we took the land from the Native Americans. It has nothing to do with skin color. It has nothing to do with Jewish nothing. It has to do with there were indigenous people on the land, and then these other people came in and took the land from indigenous people and made it exclusive to them, whereas previously when the indigenous had it, it was under the caretakership of the collective. So that's the answer. If Israel hadn't stolen the Palestinians' land, the left wouldn't care at all about this. Israel provably came in. There are documentaries about this. Israel provably came in, took the land from the Palestinians, claimed it as theirs, kicked the Palestinians off the land, put the Palestinians in the open-air concentration camp that is Gaza, made the Palestinians go through several checkpoints just to get everywhere, forbid the Palestinians from going some places in Israel because they're exclusive for Israel. It's like, if Israel and the Jews hadn't taken the Palestinian land, the left wouldn't give a flying flip about it. If Americans, the Pilgrims or whatever, the colonists in America, hadn't taken the land of the Native Americans, the left wouldn't give a flip about it. But it's all about who came in and took the land from someone else.
Definitions of other forms of racism, and the example I use is anti-Palestinian racism. Even requesting that institutions incorporate those definitions to at least sit alongside.
Are you shitting me? The only reason the Republicans are trying to abolish the NEA is because the NEA cut ties with the ADL. Are you shitting me? Are you shitting me? They aren't even doing it for the right reasons. Of course. Why can't the Republicans do anything for the right fucking reason? It's not because the NEA is organizing mass protests against the Trump administration all over the country and obviously doing political organizing that they're not supposed to be doing. No. The Republicans have no fuck off problem with that. But the minute that the NEA cuts ties with the ADL, well, they're going to show them. Of course. I should have known. I should have known that there was something going on. I should have known.
Definitions of anti-Semitism and to provide some counterbalance, which I completely understand the impetus for, because we're operating in an arena which is so unbalanced in favor of Jewish safety and the protection of that, and against any kind of recognition of the existence of anti-Palestinian racism. I argue that this is nonetheless problematic because of the ability of the institution to set the terms, right? And as soon as you endow an institution the possibility to establish the terms, and most importantly, to be able to punish on the basis of those terms, then you've lost the possibility to retain that kind of radical critique against the colonial institutions, talking about universities, for example, where I am situated
colonial
in Australia. Obviously, universities are colonial institutions. They are the ones who are going to set the terms. And if we put that alongside the earlier discussion of the incorporation of indigenization and themes of self-determination by colonial institutions, and the fact that they do nothing to unsettle, the settler colonial status quo, then they become relatively problematic. But I just want to say, lest it be misinterpreted, I'm not arguing that we don't need definitions. We need ways to be able to conceptualize our experiences and to be able to theorize them. But we do that for ourselves, right? We do that for ourselves. And it's an ongoing dialogue because, like the racial regime shows, the recalibration action, this is constantly undergoing change. So you can't take a definition and set it in stone and write it down somewhere and that's it. We're constantly having to negotiate around that. And of course, there are conflicts among radicals, right? But allowing institutions to incorporate, legislate, and punish on the basis of these definitions is, I think, problematic.
Well, I guess the last question to conclude then, just to bring it back, you mentioned again the constant recalibration of racial regimes, so we'll bring it back to the racial regime. You say in the book how they're defined by their incompleteness. They're never entirely successful because they're always subject to continual resistance, even if that's sometimes like elided in history or whatever. And you quote Robinson, who is maybe in turn citing Edward Said and saying,
Hang
in human
on.
history, there's always something beyond the reach.
Zed, the left does understand things. You don't understand the left. The reason you think the left doesn't understand things is because you don't understand the left. So I'm going to encourage, and this is not the first time you've said this in the chat today. So I'm going to encourage you to put aside this notion that the left doesn't want to understand things. They do understand things. You don't understand them. That is the problem. So much because that's what great. Okay, what you really want me to say, what you're trying to get me to say is this is about the Jews. The reality is there is not such a focus on the Palestinians. The Palestinian question is the same as every other question the left tackles. If you think the left is 100% focused on Palestine, I encourage you to watch the socialism streams that we did over the Socialism Conference weekend. You're going to see they talk about a lot of stuff that is in Palestine. So you are mistaken. I appreciate you asking questions, but you are mistaken. They are not entirely focused on Palestine. Palestine is one of many, 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 many issues the left talks about. And if you don't understand that, you need to start listening to the left and spend less time listening to conservative bullshit con artists. Trump has no fuck off idea what's being taught in schools. I'm sorry. That's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my life. Trump has no idea. He has no idea about the people we're watching right now. He has no idea how they're organizing. No one in his administration pays attention to this. I promise you, if you think Trump knows this and he's playing some game of 4D chess, that's crazy and it's unhinged from reality. I'm very, very sorry to tell you.
Of dominating systems, no matter how deeply they saturate society. And this is obviously what makes change possible. So I guess as we conclude, it might be interesting to dwell on some of the ways in which the current racial regime, it has been exposed, is being exposed, attacked, and therefore weakened by resistance. And that could be perhaps in relation to the global intifada against Israeli genocide or any other example you can give. But yeah, just interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is really, really important because I think there's a lot of tendency to be extremely pessimistic about the possibilities for radical change. I don't think that that's helpful or truthful, because if we use the analytic of the racial regime, and as I said earlier, and building on Robinson, how they're constantly having to readjust in reaction to resistance from below that, as he says, exposes their workings, I mean, their mechanisms of assembly, and kind of strips them bare and exposes them. That's obviously happening. There's so much more knowledge. And I think, obviously you could say it takes a genocide in order to expose these things, but there are certain things.
That diagram is completely wrong. Palestine is not the nexus of the socialist agenda. Whoever drew that diagram has no fucking clue what they're talking about. Reagan did a modified version of that diagram, which correctly places capitalism as the nexus of the socialist agenda. But that diagram is fun. This is, again, will you guys please, I promise you, you are going to understand so much about the left if you stop listening to your conservative bullshit con artists. There is no one on the right, with a very rare exception. There is almost no one on the right who understands any of this. Almost no memes on the right are actually accurate. So if you're not seeing it come from someone in my community, like, it's probably not accurate. And that is one of the memes that is literally not at all accurate.
In relatively recent times that were
no, you didn't.
obscure.
You never. No. You never saw that. I would never retweet that meme. I retweeted a modified meme that Reagan did, which put capitalism as the nexus. Capitalism is the hub. Palestine is one of many, 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 many spokes
that have become very, very obvious because of the kind of the laying bare of the enormity of kind of racial fascism, and certain things that no longer have to be kind of debated, things that are much more clear and obvious, as I'm saying, because of the extent to which we're just seeing them before our eyes. Now, I'm not naive. I'm not saying that this is writ large, that this is a done deal, that this has been achieved. I mean, one of the things I was just discussing today with somebody is that, the majority of people are choosing not to see what's happening. You can curate your social media feed in such a way, and certainly the mainstream media is not giving it to you, just simply not see what's going on, be that in terms of the genocide in Palestine, or indeed, I mean, even more so when it comes to Congo, Sudan, or even things that are happening in your local area, which are completely and utterly unseen. I mean, things like around deaths in custody in relation to Indigenous people here, or vigilante violence against Indigenous people, or level of disappearance of Indigenous women, in all of the settler colonies, or the crimes against refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in general. I mean, just recently, Keir Starmer's pronouncements. I mean, it's not as if, they're very acute, but it's nothing new in terms of how the British state, treats migrants for many, many decades. So I'm not naive, but I think the workings of these things is much more clear to many people, and that this kind of refutation or refusal of the terms, again, the terms of order, to use Robinson's way of putting things, is a first step to taking more radical action against the order as it stands. And that's the part which is the most difficult, because as the racial regime is sharpened and recalibrated, the repression mounts. This kind of dialectical situation between repression and co-optation and domestication. These two things are going hand in hand, and they're happening very successfully.
Domestication? Where have we heard that before?
People are fearful to take action because the level of repression is so strong. But also people are kind of massaged into believing that institutions of various kinds, if we kind of go along with certain processes that have been ongoing and that kind of weirdly can coexist with this level of repression. So I'm thinking about decolonizing and indigenizing and diversifying, and all of these things are kind of still happening, although weakened, right? But they're still happening in certain pockets, and some people will still be kind of massaged into them because of the kinds of rewards that have been dangled in front of them to enable them to, sweeten the kind of the journey or whatever. So this is the critical juncture, and I think you're seeing it. I mean, just now we've seen students at Columbia University, despite everything, starting an encampment again. These kinds of things are happening. I've witnessed the kinds of conversations, the levels to which very young people very often are willing to go in order to kind of really, it's not just challenging the status quo, it's putting their bodies on the line and their futures on the line in very radical ways.
Oh, look, we have one of Andrew Wilson's retards in the chat. How you gonna say you're all about ideas and discussion and then ghost a guy who wants to debate you? Rudy, I'm going to explain to you how calendars work. Andrew Wilson belligerently came into my replies and demanded that I pick out a time at 9 p.m. in the next week, or else he wasn't going to do it because he is a fucking child. Sadly for you and Andrew, Rudy, I actually have a series of obligations that means that I don't have a 9 p.m. time slot available any day this week. I'm doing other things. I'm doing other things with people who are not rude to me. I'm doing other things with people who aren't whining and complaining in my replies. I'm doing other things with people who pay me money to do other things. And no matter what your fucking feelings are, and I promise you I care even less about Andrew's feelings, those things are not getting canceled because Andrew Wilson is crying in my replies. Calendars are a thing. Adults use them. I know you're probably not an adult. You're probably just a child sitting in your mom's basement, like whining and complaining on the internet all day. Probably don't even have a fucking job, so you've never had to maintain a calendar in your life. But I have obligations that I'm going to fulfill, and those obligations take place at 9 o'clock every day this week. So if Andrew wants to act like an adult and come into my DMs and actually schedule a time that works for both of us, I will debate him any time that fits into my schedule, which usually does have 9 p.m. slots open, but not this week. If he wanted to debate me at 9 p.m. this week, he should have arranged it 4 fucking weeks ago when I actually was talking to him about this, because 4 weeks ago, there were lots of 9 p.m. slots open this week. Sadly, he came into my replies demanding 2 days ago when everything had already been booked. Rudy, that's how calendars work.
that are showing, I think, the extent to which the center cannot hold, right, to use that expression. And I think there's radical...
Funny how she's never too busy to monologue for 3 hours, but suddenly pack when it's time to defend her takes. Rudy still hasn't figured out how calendars work, has he? He still hasn't figured out how calendars work. Hey, Rudy, guess what? This is my time to pontificate. It's not 9 p.m. Why don't you go tell Andrew to pick out another time that I actually have free in my schedule? Do you understand how that works, Rudy? Now, I know your schedule's probably really clear because you don't have a fucking job and you don't do anything of value other than whine and complain on the internet. But some people actually have things that they do in the world for clients or to make money or things like that. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go do those things. Andrew wants to debate me. He can be an adult and schedule a fucking time. Not smart enough to be here, Rudy. Not smart enough to be here. I'm really sorry. Like, you have to, like, minimally, bro, you have to understand how calendars work to be on my channel. Seriously. Andrew might let any riffraff retard into his audience, and I understand that. Andrew goes on these shows where he debates OnlyFans who actually watches the Whatever podcast that has an IQ over 75. I mean, can we be honest about that? Forget the Fresh and Fit podcast. It's like black people podcast. Like, we don't even bother with that. So sorry, Rudy. Yeah, I bet Rudy is actually Joe. I bet you're actually right about that. Anyway, this is basically done anyway. We're basically done.
Right there.
Absolutely. Well, Alana, I mean, just... Basically
done. Had some trolls in the audience today. Had some retards in the audience today. Answered some good questions today. I think this was a really good stream to watch. I hope you guys enjoyed the show and learned a thing or two. As a reminder, it is Tuesday night. And as I just told Rudy, who doesn't know how to read a calendar, I actually have a show at 9 p.m. tonight. And so I'm going to go take a break. I'm going to go eat some dinner. And then we're going to come back and we're going to do Disenrage. Disenrage is a spirituality show that I do on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. We're going to be talking tonight about the first religions. And it's going to be awesome and it's going to be relaxing. And it's going to be way better than debating Andrew Wilson because I already had this scheduled. And sadly, Andrew Wilson did not get on the schedule before I scheduled it. Because that's how fucking calendars work. Anyway, I'm going to go take a break. Thanks, guys, for hanging out. I will be back tomorrow if you don't come to the spirituality show. She's not too busy to debate, just too scared. Oh, it is Jill. It is Jill. Look at that, you fucking fat-ass stalker. How many accounts has Jill gone through today? 4? 4 accounts. The fat-ass has gone through 4 fucking accounts in a single day. Yeah, this is Jill. Again, Jill has apparently obsessively watched the Andrew Wilson stuff. She was probably getting off to it the entire time. This is the fucking nut job that we have in the chat. You're going to become familiar with Jill. You're going to become familiar with her tone. You're going to become familiar with her bullshit because she does this shit all the time. Because Jill is a 500-pound fucking shut-in stalker who is obsessed with me and needs to go to fucking therapy. All right, let's block another one of Jill's accounts. And she's blocked. She is blocked. She is blocked. Bye, fat ass. We'll see you next time. All right, guys. That's all I have for tonight. I'm going to be back at 9 p.m. I will be back at 5 p.m. tomorrow if you want to join me then. And then we're doing an interview with Amalek at 9 p.m. tomorrow. The next thing I have in my schedule for people who are interested in how calendars work. Until then, I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Have a good one. Bye.
How are you feeling? How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you?
That's difficult to answer. dislike me because I am not completely like you.
I'm not clear. How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
That's difficult to answer.